Hey everyone! Tonight we're diving into one of history's most fascinating financial secrets that completely changes how you think about World War I. Picture this. It's July 1914, and you're walking through the financial district of London, the centre of the world's banking system. But something's wrong. Behind those marble facades and polished brass fixtures, bankers are having emergency meetings. They know something the public doesn't. The entire system is dying, and they're running out of time to save it. The textbooks tell a simple story about World War I, an assassination in Sarajevo, a tangle of alliances pulling nations into conflict, armies marching across Europe to their doom. But the records reveal something the history books skip over entirely. In July 1914, Europe's banking system was collapsing from its own weight, not from any war. And what I'm about to show you might completely change how you understand the greatest conflict in human history. But before we step into those secret boardrooms together, I'd love it if you could hit that subscribe button if you enjoy these deep dives into how money and empires really shaped history. And hey, I'm genuinely curious. Where are you watching from tonight? Your apartment in Chicago? A dorm room in Boston? Maybe you're winding down after a long day in Portland. Drop a comment below and let me know. I read every single one, and I absolutely love hearing from fellow history enthusiasts who want to understand how the world really works. Now get comfortable. Maybe dim those lights if you haven't already. Turn on some white noise if that helps you relax. And let's dive into this incredible journey through financial history together. No need to remember every detail or every date. Just let the story wash over you as we explore one of the most remarkable transformations in modern history. Ready? Let's begin. London, in late July 1914, was experiencing something that should have been impossible. The financial centre of the world was freezing solid. Shares crashed overnight, while depositors couldn't access their funds for days at a time. The discount markets where banks traded commercial paper had simply stopped functioning. Banks that needed cash couldn't get it at any price. Can you imagine that? The most sophisticated financial system ever created was seizing up like an engine without oil. Then came the announcement that shocked the world. On July 30th, the London Stock Exchange Council made an unprecedented decision. The exchange would close the next day. Not for a few hours, not for a day or two. It would stay closed indefinitely. Think about what this means. The London Stock Exchange had operated continuously through wars, panics, and crises for over a century. It had never simply shut down. Until now. The New York Stock Exchange followed on July 31st, then Paris, then Berlin, then Vienna. By August 1st, 1914, virtually every major stock exchange in the world had closed its doors. This had never happened before in financial history. The entire global financial system had essentially stopped operating. And here's what most people don't realize. This wasn't caused by the war. This happened before the war started. The war didn't break the financial system. It saved it. Let me take you inside what was really happening behind closed doors. Some 50 countries around the world faced simultaneous financial crisis in late July 1914. Bank runs were spreading like wildfire across Europe. Stock markets were collapsing, and a global system built over decades was melting down. The crisis didn't start in August when the guns fired. It had been choking the life out of banks throughout 1913, long before Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated. Behind the marble facades and polished brass fixtures that I mentioned, bankers were scrambling to hide what their balance sheets revealed. Credit markets in London, Paris, and Berlin had been seizing up for months. Reserve ratios had fallen to dangerous lows across the entire system. Many major institutions were operating on the thinnest margins imaginable. One bad day from total collapse. Picture yourself as one of these bankers, looking at the numbers week after week, knowing that time is running out. Gold, the foundation holding the entire system together, was being hoarded by central banks in a desperate scramble. This created a liquidity drought that threatened to bring down even the strongest institutions. Banks couldn't simply print money to save themselves from the approaching disaster. The gold standard had become a straitjacket, and one major depositor panic would trigger a chain collapse that nobody could stop. The mathematics were brutal, and everyone who understood them knew it. Then something remarkable happened when war was declared in August. Suddenly, the banking system that should have died was rescued instead. Normal rules were suspended overnight without debate. Gold requirements disappeared as if they'd never existed. Government guarantees flowed to the banks in unprecedented amounts. The crisis that had been building for years was instantly blamed on the war emergency rather than decades of reckless expansion. Stay with me here, because this is where the story gets really fascinating. What if the greatest conflict in human history wasn't a disruption to finance, but its salvation? What if World War I didn't break the banking system, but saved banks from their own failures? To understand why the war became a rescue operation, we need to see how banks had built their own trap over 4 decades of reckless expansion. Let me show you exactly how this happened. Between 1870 and 1913, European banks grew their deposit bases by roughly 400%. That's a 4-fold increase, while gold reserves increased by barely 80%. Can you see the problem building here? The mathematics of this imbalance created a ticking time bomb that every banking executive understood, but nobody dared acknowledge publicly. Fractional reserve banking had always involved risk, but by 1913, the system had been pushed to its absolute breaking point. Each bank's survival now depended entirely on every other bank remaining solvent. This created an interconnected house of cards where one collapse would trigger a cascade. The bankers had created a system where individual caution meant nothing. Collective failure was the only possible outcome once confidence broke. Think about that for a moment. They had built a system that could only survive if everyone believed it was sound. The moment that belief cracked, everything would fall. To understand how this happened, let me take you back to the late 19th century and show you the structure of European banking. The gold standard, adopted by most major economies between 1870 and 1900, was supposed to provide stability. Every unit of currency issued by a bank had to be backed by a corresponding amount of gold held in reserve. This created a natural limit on money creation and prevented governments from simply printing currency to solve their problems. In theory, the system was self-regulating and stable. Picture a world where money couldn't be created from thin air, where every pound or franc or mark was backed by actual gold sitting in a vault somewhere. That was the promise of the gold standard. It was supposed to be the foundation of sound money and honest banking. But in practice, banks had discovered ways to exploit the system's flexibility. And that exploitation would nearly destroy civilization. The key was fractional reserve banking, a practice that allowed banks to lend out far more money than they actually held in gold reserves. If a bank held £100 of gold, it might issue loans worth £500, keeping only a fraction in reserve to satisfy day-to-day withdrawals. This worked perfectly as long as depositors maintained confidence. The average person never questioned whether their bank actually held the gold to back their deposits. They assumed the system was sound because it had always worked before. But here's what really blows my mind about this whole arrangement. This confidence was the only thing holding the entire structure together. The moment depositors lost faith and demanded their gold, the illusion would shatter. Can you imagine building an entire civilization's financial system on collective belief? That's exactly what they had done. And by 1913, that belief was starting to crack. By the 1890s, European banks were operating at reserve ratios that would seem reckless by modern standards. The Bank of England, supposedly the most conservative institution in the world, was running reserve ratios of approximately 15% by 1900. Think about what that means. For every pound of gold in the vault, they had created £5 of credit. German banks were even more aggressive, with some major institutions operating below 10%. French banks, caught between British conservatism and German aggression, fell somewhere in the middle at around 12%. These numbers meant that for every pound of gold actually held in vaults, banks were creating £5 to £10 of credit through loans and deposits. The system worked because only a small percentage of depositors ever demanded their funds at the same time. But the math was inherently unstable. If just 20% of depositors at a German bank demanded their gold simultaneously, the bank would fail instantly. Do you see the vulnerability here? The entire system was built on the assumption that most people would never ask for their money at the same time. It was like musical chairs, but with your life savings. As long as the music played, everything seemed fine. But the moment it stopped, there wouldn't be enough chairs for everyone. The colonial lending spree of the 1880s and 1890s had turned into a nightmare that kept bank executives awake at night. European banks had financed massive infrastructure projects across South America, Africa, and Asia, convinced that colonial expansion would generate unlimited returns. Let me show you just how wrong they were. The reality was very different from the glossy investment prospectuses they had sold to shareholders and depositors. Massive loans to South American governments were bleeding red ink. Argentina's default in 1890 served as just the most visible wound, but it was far from the only one. The Baring crisis of 1890 had nearly destroyed the entire British banking system. Baring Brothers, one of London's most prestigious merchant banks, had lent enormous sums to Argentina for railway construction and government financing. When Argentina couldn't pay, Baring Brothers faced immediate bankruptcy. Picture the panic in London's banking district. One of the oldest, most respected names in finance was about to collapse. Only a coordinated rescue operation by the Bank of England and other major institutions prevented complete meltdown. But here's what makes this even more disturbing. The rescue set a dangerous precedent. Banks learned that if they were large enough and well connected enough, they wouldn't be allowed to fail. This created what we now call moral hazard. Institutions would take excessive risks because they believed they'd be rescued if things went wrong. And after 1890, European banks actually increased their risky lending, not decreased it. They were confident that central banks would intervene if necessary. Can you imagine that logic? Failure teaches us to take more risk, not less, because we know we'll be rescued. This is the foundation of the system that would nearly collapse in 1914. The Ottoman Empire's debt crisis was spreading financial contagion across every institution that had believed in endless imperial expansion. European banks had financed everything from railway construction in Anatolia to port development in the Levant. They were convinced that the Ottoman state would generate sufficient tax revenue to repay these loans. By 1900, it was clear this wouldn't happen. The Ottoman government was essentially bankrupt. The Ottoman Public Debt Administration, established in 1881, was supposed to ensure repayment by giving European creditors direct control over certain Ottoman tax revenues. Think about that. European banks literally controlled parts of the Ottoman government's revenue stream. But even with this control, the returns were disappointing. Turkish railways operated at losses. Port facilities sat underutilized. Agricultural development projects failed to increase productivity as projected. European banks were stuck with billions in non-performing loans that couldn't be written off without triggering depositor panic. The money was gone, but the accounting fiction had to be maintained. Can you see the trap they were in? They couldn't admit the loans were bad, because that would reveal they were insolvent. But they also couldn't collect on the loans, because the Ottoman Empire couldn't pay. So they just kept the worthless loans on their books and hoped something would change. African colonial ventures that were supposed to generate profits were instead producing nothing but compounding losses on the balance sheets. King Leopold II's Congo Free State was bleeding money despite brutal resource extraction. French investments in North Africa were underwater. British financing for South African mining operations had produced some returns, but nothing like the projections that had justified the loans. Let me give you a sense of the scale here. By 1910, European banks collectively held billions in African colonial debt that was effectively worthless. German banks had perhaps the worst colonial portfolio. German Southwest Africa, German East Africa, and Cameroon all required continuous capital injections just to maintain basic administration. None of these territories generated sufficient economic activity to justify their financing costs. By 1910, German banks held approximately 800 million marks in African colonial debt that was effectively worthless. But it couldn't be acknowledged as such without triggering a banking crisis. So the fiction continued. Banks valued these loans at full face value on their balance sheets. Shareholders received dividends based on phantom profits from loans that would never be repaid, and depositors had no idea that a significant portion of their bank's assets were actually worthless. The entire system was built on accounting fraud, but it was fraud that everyone participated in, because acknowledging the truth would destroy everything. Domestically, the vulnerabilities were just as severe and far more immediate. Property speculation bubbles in London and Paris had inflated real estate values beyond any rational calculation. London property prices had tripled between 1890 and 1910, driven entirely by speculative lending. Banks were financing purchases at valuations that assumed perpetual price increases. When prices stabilized or fell, borrowers found themselves underwater, unable to repay loans that exceeded the actual value of their properties. The Paris real estate bubble was even more extreme. Baron Haussmann's rebuilding of Paris in the 1860s and 1870s had created a template for urban speculation. Banks financed massive apartment buildings and commercial developments, expecting rental income to cover debt service. By 1900, vacancy rates were rising as construction outpaced demand. Many buildings stood half empty, generating insufficient income to service their debt. Picture walking through fashionable Parisian districts and seeing "for rent" signs everywhere. The dream of endless urban growth was colliding with reality. Industrial loans to steel manufacturers, railway companies, and overbuilt factories represented exposure to sectors with massive overcapacity. The railroad boom of the 1890s had created redundant networks across Europe. Multiple railway companies competed for the same traffic, driving down profits and making debt service difficult. British railways, once considered rock-solid investments, were struggling to generate returns by 1910. The age of unlimited railway expansion was over, but the debts remained. Steel production had expanded far faster than demand. Germany alone had built steel-making capacity sufficient for all of Europe. When companies competed for market share by cutting prices, profit margins evaporated. Banks holding debt from steel manufacturers watched nervously as their borrowers struggled to make payments. Writing off these loans would mean recognizing massive losses that would destroy bank capital ratios. So the fiction was maintained that everything was fine. Consumer credit had expanded without adequate collateral backing, and the first wave of defaults would reveal just how hollow these loans actually were. Middle-class families across Europe were borrowing against future income to finance consumption today. Banks had convinced themselves that economic growth would continue indefinitely, allowing borrowers to service their debts from rising wages. This assumption was about to be tested. Think about a system built entirely on optimism about the future. What happens when that optimism fades? But the gold standard created the ultimate stranglehold that made every other problem unsolvable. Banks couldn't simply print their way out of trouble because gold convertibility prevented any monetary expansion. This meant depositor runs became existential threats. Any loss of confidence would trigger bank death within days. The mechanism was brutally simple and unstoppable. Let me walk you through exactly how this trap worked because understanding this is crucial to seeing why the war became necessary. Under the gold standard, any depositor could walk into a bank and demand their deposits be converted to gold at a fixed rate. If a bank in London promised to redeem pounds at the rate of £1 for 1/20th of an ounce of gold, it was legally obligated to make that exchange. If the bank couldn't provide the gold, it was bankrupt. There was no flexibility, no negotiation, no grace period. Can you imagine a financial system with zero room for error? That's exactly what they had built. This created a prisoner's dilemma for depositors. If everyone maintained confidence, the system worked perfectly. But if rumours spread that a bank was in trouble, rational depositors would rush to withdraw their funds before the gold ran out. The first depositors to withdraw would get their gold. The last would find empty vaults. This created a powerful incentive for bank runs, even when banks were fundamentally sound. Do you see how the system itself incentivized panic? Trust was everything, and trust was incredibly fragile. Central banks competed with each other for the finite gold supply, driving hoarding behavior that drained liquidity from the entire system. The Bank of England, the Banque de France, the Reichsbank, and the Austro-Hungarian Bank all maintained gold reserves to back their currencies. But they also viewed gold reserves as a measure of national strength and prestige. No central bank wanted to appear weaker than its rivals. National pride became entangled with gold reserves, making rational policy impossible. This competition created perverse incentives throughout the system. When economic conditions required expanding the money supply to stimulate growth, central banks were reluctant to do so because it would require reducing their gold coverage ratios. When crisis threatened and contraction was dangerous, central banks hoarded gold instead of lending it out, making the crisis worse. The system that was supposed to provide stability instead amplified economic volatility. Picture a medical system where doctors refused to treat patients because they were worried about running out of medicine. That's essentially what they had created. The banks had chained themselves to a system that guaranteed their destruction the moment the public stopped believing in their solvency. And by 1913, the warning signs were becoming impossible to hide. The panic was no longer theoretical. It was happening behind closed boardroom doors across the financial capitals of the world. Let me take you inside these secret meetings, because what was discussed there reveals the true state of the system. The Bank of England held emergency consultations with Treasury officials throughout 1913 as liquidity pressures mounted. Sir John Bradbury, Secretary to the Treasury, was receiving weekly reports about deteriorating conditions in the London money markets by early 1913. Interbank lending rates were behaving erratically, spiking to levels not seen since the Bearing Crisis. The Bank of England's reserve ratio, published weekly, showed steady deterioration from a comfortable 48% in January 1913 to a concerning 32% by June. Banking insiders knew exactly what these numbers meant. The margin for error was evaporating week by week. Every week brought the system closer to the point where any shock could trigger collapse. Imagine being one of these officials, watching the numbers decline relentlessly, knowing that millions of people depended on a system that was quietly failing. The responsibility must have been absolutely crushing. And the worst part? They couldn't tell anyone what was really happening. The Rothschild family, with branches spanning London, Paris, and Vienna, coordinated their responses to the deteriorating conditions they could see spreading across the continent. As merchant bankers with exposure across multiple jurisdictions, the Rothschilds had a unique view of the interconnected European financial system. Their private correspondence from 1913, now available in various archives, shows growing alarm about systemic fragility. These weren't public statements meant to maintain confidence. These were private discussions revealing genuine fear. Lionel Nathan de Rothschild in London was coordinating with his cousins in Paris and Vienna about defensive positioning. They were quietly reducing exposure to the riskiest loans, particularly those to Eastern European governments and speculative industrial ventures. They increased their gold holdings, both as a hedge against currency instability and as a potential source of liquidity if credit markets froze. Most importantly, they were preparing for a crisis they saw as inevitable. The smartest money in Europe was running scared. JP Morgan's partners were sending private warnings to the architects of the newly proposed Federal Reserve System in America. The panic of 1907 had convinced American banking leaders that the United States needed a central bank to prevent future crises. JP Morgan himself had organized the rescue operation that prevented complete collapse in 1907. But at age 76, he knew he wouldn't be around to do it again. The banking system needed institutional mechanisms, not individual heroes. But Morgan's partners were watching Europe with growing concern. If the European banking system collapsed, American banks would be dragged down with it. American banks held significant European assets and facilitated transatlantic trade. A European crisis would immediately become an American crisis. The Federal Reserve, still being designed in 1913, needed to be operational before the European situation deteriorated further. This urgency was being communicated to Senator Nelson Aldrich and the other architects of what would become the Federal Reserve Act. The Warburg brothers maintained constant communication between their European banking operations and their American interests, watching the crisis build from both sides of the Atlantic. Paul Warburg, who had emigrated from Germany to become a partner at Kuhn, Loeb and Company in New York, was the principal architect of the Federal Reserve Plan. His brother Max remained in Germany as head of the M. Warburg and Company banking firm in Hamburg. These brothers had a perspective that few others possessed. They could see the crisis from both continents simultaneously. The Warburg correspondence from 1912 to 1913 reveals brothers deeply concerned about systemic instability in European banking. Max was reporting from Germany about dangerous levels of leverage in the Berlin banks and about the Reichsbank's inability to provide adequate liquidity during stress periods. Paul was using these insights to design the Federal Reserve structure, particularly its elastic currency provision and lender of last resort function. The Federal Reserve was being designed specifically to avoid the kind of crisis the Warburgs saw building in Europe. Think about that. The American Central Bank was being created as a response to a European crisis that hadn't officially happened yet. The insiders knew what was coming. The warning signs were visible to anyone with access to the real numbers, and insiders were paying very close attention. Interbank lending rates began spiking in the first half of 1914. As institutions grew increasingly reluctant to lend to each other, the overnight rate in London jumped from a normal 3% to over 5% on several occasions in early 1914, then to 8% briefly in July. These spikes indicated that banks suspected counterparty risk. They weren't confident that other banks were as sound as they claimed. Trust within the banking system itself was breaking down. Major banks were quietly liquidating questionable assets before the markets could realize just how worthless many of these holdings had become. The process was delicate and required coordination. If one bank suddenly dumped its Ottoman railway bonds, prices would collapse, and all banks holding similar assets would have to recognize losses. Instead, banks quietly traded problematic assets back and forth at inflated prices, maintaining the fiction of value while gradually finding buyers who didn't understand what they were purchasing. It was a shell game, moving worthless paper between players who hoped they wouldn't be the last one holding it. Insurance companies started refusing to underwrite certain bank bonds. This was a clear signal that actuaries were seeing risks the public statements weren't acknowledging. Insurance underwriters, whose job was to mathematically assess risk, were looking at bank balance sheets and concluding that the probability of default was higher than banks were admitting. By mid-1913, several London insurance firms had quietly stopped offering coverage for bonds issued by certain German and Austrian banks. This was a devastating signal, but it never reached the general public. Insurance companies had no incentive to announce their risk assessments publicly. That would trigger exactly the panic everyone wanted to avoid. The information remained confined to a small circle of financial insiders. Wealthy clients who maintained close relationships with senior bankers received private advice to diversify their holdings out of bank deposits. The evidence for this comes from later memoirs and from patterns visible in gold flows during 1913. Britain experienced net gold outflows of approximately £30 million during 1913, even though its trade balance was positive. The gold was flowing into private hands as wealthy individuals quietly converted paper deposits into metal. Picture elegant dinners at London clubs, where bankers would quietly mention to trusted clients that conditions were rather unsettled. This wasn't panic. It was prudent, wealthy families taking quiet, defensive action based on private information from their bankers. If you were a British aristocrat with £100,000 in deposits at a London bank, and your banker mentioned over dinner that conditions were unsettled, what would you do? The rational response was to convert some of those deposits to gold and store it in private vaults. Multiply this behavior across hundreds of wealthy families, and you get significant gold outflows that weakened the banking system further. The system was being drained from the top down. The mechanism of concealment required coordination across multiple institutions, and even into the media itself. Banks owned or heavily influenced major newspapers and financial journals, and bad news was systematically suppressed to prevent the panic everyone feared. The Times of London, the Financial Times, Le Figaro in Paris, and the Frankfurter Zeitung in Germany all maintained close relationships with major banks through advertising revenue and shared board members. This wasn't conspiracy in the dramatic sense. It was mutual interest alignment. When banking problems occurred, coverage was muted or spun positively. A bank might experience a surge in withdrawals, but the newspaper report would describe it as slight liquidity pressure, adequately managed by prudent reserves. A bank might lower its reserve ratio, but the article would explain this as efficient capital deployment to meet commercial credit demand. The language was carefully crafted to maintain confidence while technically reporting facts. Can you see how information was being managed? Truth was being filtered through language designed to prevent understanding. Government officials coordinated their public messaging carefully to maintain confidence while privately preparing for the worst. Chancellor of the Exchequer, David Lloyd George, gave reassuring speeches about the soundness of British banking throughout 1913, while simultaneously holding emergency meetings with the Bank of England about crisis preparation. German Finance Minister Hermann Kuhn made similar public statements while privately warning the Reichstag that emergency measures might become necessary. The public face showed confidence. The private reality was fear. The gap between public statements and private actions was enormous. Publicly, everything was sound. Privately, governments were developing contingency plans for debt moratoria, gold standard suspension, and emergency lending facilities. These plans weren't created in August 1914 as a response to war. They were developed throughout 1913 in anticipation of a financial crisis that appeared increasingly inevitable. The war simply provided the political cover to implement plans that had been sitting in treasury drawers for months. Think about that. The response was ready before the crisis officially arrived. Creative accounting practices masked reserve deficiencies that would have triggered immediate runs if depositors had known the truth. Banks classified assets in ways that made their balance sheets look stronger than they actually were. Loans that were in default could be categorized as temporarily impaired but sound, rather than written off as losses. Colonial investments with no realistic path to profitability could be valued at original cost, rather than marked down to zero. Think about this for a moment. The numbers everyone relied on to assess bank safety were fiction. The accounting standards of 1913 gave banks enormous discretion. There was no independent auditing of the kind we have today. Banks essentially certified their own financial statements, and regulators accepted these certifications unless problems became so obvious they couldn't be ignored. This allowed banks to hide deteriorating conditions for months or even years, buying time in the hope that economic conditions would improve. Hope was the strategy. It wasn't working. Banks even entered into informal agreements to support each other's stock prices, creating the illusion of stability where none actually existed. If shares of Deutsche Bank began declining on the Berlin exchange, other major banks would quietly purchase shares to prop up the price. This prevented the price decline from signaling financial weakness to the market. The practice was illegal under modern securities law, but was common in 1913. It was viewed as prudent cooperation among banking partners, rather than market manipulation. The market itself was being manipulated to hide reality. What the bankers knew, and what terrified them, was that a single major depositor, panic or sovereign default, would trigger a chain collapse that no amount of coordination could stop. The system was so interconnected that every bank held deposits at other banks, held loans to other banks, and had counterparty exposure through various financial contracts. If one major institution failed, it would default on obligations to dozens of other banks, creating a cascade effect. Picture dominoes arranged in a circle, where every piece depends on every other piece. The mathematics of contagion were well understood by 1913. Banks had analysed what would happen if a major institution like Kreditanstalt in Vienna or Société Générale in Paris suddenly failed. The models showed that within 72 hours, the failure would propagate to every major banking centre in Europe. Within a week, half the banks in Europe would be insolvent. Within 2 weeks, the entire system would be gone. Banking as Europeans knew, it would cease to exist. They had built a system that could only exist in its entirety, or not at all. They needed either a massive distraction or a complete system reset. They got both when the war began in August 1914. But to understand how the war rescued the banking system, we need to examine the immediate pre-war crisis in detail. Because by July 1914, the situation had deteriorated beyond anything bankers had previously experienced. The crisis was no longer building in the background. It was exploding into public view. Let me show you exactly what happened in those final weeks before the guns started firing. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand on June 28, 1914, triggered a political crisis that quickly became a financial crisis. As diplomatic tensions escalated between Austria-Hungary and Serbia, then between Austria-Hungary and Russia, then between Germany and France, investors began moving money out of European assets. Stock prices fell, bond yields spiked, credit markets began seizing up. The political crisis was accelerating a financial crisis that had been brewing for months. Picture the panic spreading through financial districts across Europe. By mid-July, London was experiencing what would now be called a liquidity crisis. Banks were unable to convert assets into cash because buyers had disappeared. The discount market, where banks sold commercial bills to raise short-term funds, had frozen. Banks holding bills couldn't find anyone willing to buy them at any reasonable price. This meant banks couldn't access liquidity, even though they held what were theoretically valuable assets. Imagine holding a deed to a house, but being unable to sell it for any price. That's exactly what banks were facing. The Bank of England's reserve ratio fell to 26% by July 23rd, a dangerously low level that gave the bank very little room to support the system if conditions worsened. The normal reserve ratio was considered safe at 40% or above. At 26%, the Bank of England was approaching the minimum level needed to maintain convertibility. If reserves fell much further, the bank would have to choose between abandoning the gold standard or allowing banks to fail. There was no third option. Can you imagine being the Bank of England governor, watching that number tick down week by week, knowing that you're running out of time and options? The London Stock Exchange saw panic selling in late July as war appeared imminent. On July 27th and 28th, shares fell between 5% and 10% across all sectors. Volumes surged as investors tried to sell before prices fell further. The exchange's settlement system began experiencing problems. There were so many transactions that the administrative machinery couldn't process them. Shares were being sold, but buyers and sellers couldn't determine who owned what. The infrastructure of the exchange was breaking down under the strain. On July 30th, the London Stock Exchange Council made the extraordinary decision to close the exchange the next day. They announced that the exchange would not open on July 31st, 1914. This was unprecedented. The London Stock Exchange had operated continuously through wars, crises and panics for over a century. Its closure signaled that the situation had moved beyond anything the exchange's mechanisms could handle. If trading continued, prices would collapse completely, and banks holding securities would face instant insolvency. The New York Stock Exchange closed on the same day, July 31st. European investors were dumping American securities to raise cash, and American prices were collapsing. The exchange's board determined that closing was preferable to allowing a complete meltdown. Stock exchanges in Paris, Berlin, Vienna, and other European capitals quickly followed. By August 1st, virtually every major stock exchange in the world had closed. This had never happened before in financial history. Think about that for a moment. The entire global financial market simply stopped operating. The implications were staggering. Banks used stock holdings as collateral for loans and as assets to meet reserve requirements. With exchanges closed, these stocks had no market value. They couldn't be sold at any price because there was no market. This meant banks couldn't determine their own solvency. They held securities that might be worth something when exchanges reopened, but nobody knew what that value would be or when exchanges would reopen. The entire concept of financial valuation had collapsed. Credit markets froze completely. Banks stopped lending to each other overnight. The interbank lending system, which normally allowed banks to borrow and lend reserves to balance their books each day, simply stopped functioning. Banks with excess reserves held onto them rather than lending them out, fearing they might need every available resource. Banks that needed reserves couldn't borrow them at any interest rate. The financial system was paralyzed. Stay with me here, because this is the moment when everything changes. Wow! As war was declared in early August, the banking crisis reached its peak. Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia on July 28th. Russia began mobilization on July 30th. Germany declared war on Russia on August 1st. Germany declared war on France on August 3rd. Britain declared war on Germany on August 4th. Within 1 week, all of Europe's major powers were at war, and the banking system was dying. Picture the chaos in banking centers across Europe. Depositors lining up at banks, officials scrambling for solutions, the old world ending before anyone fully understood what was happening. Depositors across Europe rushed to withdraw their funds. Bank runs began in Austria on July 29th, in Germany on July 31st, in France on August 1st, in Britain on August 3rd. The runs weren't organized or coordinated. They were the rational response of depositors who saw war coming and wanted their money in a form they could control. Paper money might become worthless. Bank deposits might be frozen. But gold was gold, valuable anywhere, under any circumstances. Can you imagine the fear driving these people to banks? The gold reserves of every major European bank dropped precipitously in the first days of August. The Reichsbank's gold reserves fell by 200 million marks between July 31st and August 5th. The Banque de France lost 300 million francs. The Bank of England, already operating with thin reserves, lost another £15 million. At this rate, all three central banks would exhaust their reserves within 2 weeks. When that happened, the banks would be unable to redeem their currency for gold, and the entire monetary system would collapse. This was the moment of maximum danger. The banking system of Europe, built over centuries, was hours away from complete failure. If governments had done nothing, if they had allowed the normal rules to continue operating, every major bank in Europe would have declared bankruptcy by mid-August 1914. The gold standard would have collapsed. Currencies would have become worthless. The financial infrastructure that enabled modern economic life would have ceased to exist. But something remarkable happened instead. The outbreak of war in August 1914 provided exactly the mechanisms banks needed to survive what should have been their extinction event. Within days, normal rules that had governed banking for generations were suspended across Europe and America. The speed and coordination of these changes is remarkable. It suggests that plans had been prepared in advance, waiting only for the political justification to implement them. Let me walk you through exactly how the rescue operation unfolded, step by step, because this is where you really see the pattern that repeats in every crisis. The gold standard that had constrained every banking decision was abandoned almost overnight, meaning banks no longer had to redeem their paper promises for actual gold. Britain took the first step on August 2nd, 1914, 2 days before formally declaring war on Germany. The British government announced that the August bank holiday, normally 1 day, would be extended by 3 days. Banks would remain closed until August 7th. This bought time to prepare emergency measures. Picture the government frantically drafting legislation, while depositors waited anxiously outside closed banks. On August 5th, just 1 day after declaring war, Parliament passed the Currency and Banknotes Act of 1914. This revolutionary legislation allowed the Treasury to issue paper currency in denominations of £1 and 10 shillings, backed not by gold but by government credit. Previously, the Bank of England held a monopoly on currency issue, and all currency had to be backed by gold reserves. The new Treasury notes had no gold backing. They were pure fiat currency, money by government decree. Do you see what just happened? They abandoned the gold standard in a single day. The Act also allowed the Bank of England to issue additional currency beyond its gold reserves. Before the war, the Bank of England could issue £18 million in currency without gold backing, called the fiduciary issue, and everything beyond that required pound-for-pound gold backing. The Currency Act eliminated this restriction. The Bank of England could now issue unlimited currency against government securities. The gold standard was dead in Britain, killed by emergency legislation that took less than 24 hours to pass through Parliament. A system that had governed finance for decades was gone overnight. Germany took similar action on August 4th. The Reichsbank was authorized to issue Darlehenskassenscheine, loan bureau notes, without gold backing. These were essentially government IOUs that circulated as currency. The Reichsbank also suspended gold convertibility, meaning German citizens could no longer exchange marks for gold at the central bank. The mark remained a unit of account, but it was no longer tied to gold. Its value was whatever the government said it was. Imagine waking up one morning and discovering that your money was no longer backed by anything tangible. That's what happened to Germans in August 1914. France followed on August 5th. The Banque de France received authorization to suspend gold payments and issue currency without gold backing. The French government went further, imposing limits on gold withdrawals from banks even after they reopened. Citizens could withdraw paper currency, but gold withdrawals were restricted to small amounts. The government was preventing the bank runs that had threatened to destroy the system just days earlier. The cage door was closing. Gold was being trapped in the vaults, and citizens' access to their own property was being restricted in the name of national emergency. Russia, Austria-Hungary, and Italy all took similar actions in early August. Every major combatant nation suspended the gold standard and authorized emergency currency issue within days of war being declared. The coordination is striking. These governments weren't discovering solutions independently. They were implementing a playbook that had been prepared in advance. When the emergency arrived, the response was immediate and uniform. Think about the level of preparation this required. These measures were ready to deploy the moment the political cover of war became available. Stock exchanges closed for months. New York stayed shut until December, London for 5 months, preventing the panic selling of bank shares that would have exposed their true worthlessness. The London Stock Exchange didn't reopen until January 4th, 1915. The New York Stock Exchange reopened on December 15th, 1914, but with restrictions on trading and prices. Continental European exchanges remained closed even longer, some not reopening until 1916. Can you imagine modern financial markets being closed for months? It seems impossible, yet that's exactly what happened, and it was necessary to hide the reality of bank insolvency. During the months when exchanges were closed, banks couldn't be forced to mark their securities to market value. The stocks and bonds they held were carried on balance sheets at pre-crisis values. This was pure accounting fiction, but it prevented banks from having to recognize massive losses. When exchanges finally reopened, prices had been controlled through various mechanisms to prevent the catastrophic collapse that would have occurred if markets had been allowed to trade freely in August 1914. The illusion of value was being carefully maintained through market closure and manipulation. Debt moratoria were declared across the continent, which meant all those failing loans that had been hemorrhaging losses were suddenly frozen rather than coming due. Britain declared a general moratorium on August 2nd, before even declaring war. All debts due on or after August 4th could be postponed for 1 month. This was later extended repeatedly throughout the war. Bills of exchange, the primary instrument of commercial credit, were covered by the moratorium. Banks didn't have to pay out on bills coming due, and businesses didn't have to repay bank loans. Everything was frozen in place. France declared an even more comprehensive moratorium on August 1st. All commercial obligations were suspended. Landlords couldn't evict tenants. Creditors couldn't sue debtors. The entire structure of commercial law was placed in suspension. Germany implemented similar measures on August 6th. These moratoria protected banks in multiple ways. They didn't have to pay out deposits because withdrawals were limited. They didn't have to collect on loans because borrowers were protected. The entire system was frozen in place. Picture a massive game where everyone stopped moving exactly where they stood, and no one could demand payment from anyone else. The moratoria were supposed to be temporary wartime emergency measures. In practice, they lasted for years and fundamentally changed the banking system. Loans that would have defaulted in August 1914 remained on the books as performing assets throughout the war. Colonial investments that were worthless continued to be valued at cost. The accounting fictions created by the moratoria became permanent features of bank balance sheets. Bad debts were hidden rather than written off. The crisis was papered over, not solved. Government guarantees extended to the banking sector completed the rescue operation. The British government agreed to provide taxpayer guarantees against any losses incurred by the Bank of England, as it bought up financial assets that had plunged in value. Chancellor of the Exchequer, David Lloyd George announced on August 5th that the government would indemnify the Bank of England for any losses on bills of exchange that the bank discounted during the emergency. Let me show you what this means in practice, because this is where the wealth transfer really begins. This was an extraordinary commitment. Bills of exchange were commercial credit instruments, essentially checks that could be cashed at a future date. Before the war, banks bought these bills at a discount, paying perhaps £97 for a bill worth £100 when it came due. The £3 difference was the bank's profit. But in August 1914, nobody knew if these bills would be paid when they came due. The businesses that had issued them might fail. The banks that had endorsed them might collapse. These bills might be completely worthless. The Bank of England was sitting on hundreds of millions of pounds worth of bills that might be worthless. Lloyd George's guarantee meant that if these bills weren't paid, the British government would cover the losses. Taxpayers were backstopping the entire commercial banking system. private risk had been socialized. Banks could make loans, knowing that if borrowers defaulted, the government would absorb the losses. Can you see the moral hazard being created here? Risk was being transferred from private institutions to the public. Banks would keep profits, but taxpayers would bear losses. The Currency and Banknotes Act also provided government guarantees to the banking system more broadly. Banks that held treasury notes as reserves would be protected against losses. The government promised to maintain the value of its paper currency through taxation and through its general credit. Citizens were being told to trust government paper instead of gold, and that trust was backed by the government's ability to extract resources from the population through taxation. Your wealth was now secured by the government's future ability to tax you. Think about the circularity of that promise. Germany implemented similar guarantees. The Reichsbank bought up commercial bills from private banks, effectively removing bad assets from bank balance sheets and replacing them with claims on the government. The German government also guaranteed the value of the new loan bureau notes, promising to redeem them after the war. These were promises the government would prove unable to keep, but in August 1914, they served their purpose of maintaining confidence. The future could worry about repayment. The present just needed belief. France, Russia, and Austria-Hungary all extended government credit to their banking systems in various forms. The details varied, but the pattern was consistent. Governments stepped in to absorb losses that would have destroyed private banks. Public credit replaced private credit. Taxpayers became the ultimate backstop for banking system failures. The socialization of banking losses was complete. What should have been a banking crisis became a public debt crisis instead. The bank's problems became everyone's problems. New currency was printed in massive quantities, with the monetary base expanding from £288 million in 1914 to £531 million by 1918 in Britain alone. This represented an 84% increase in the money supply in just 4 years. Under the gold standard, this expansion would have been impossible. The gold reserves simply didn't exist to back this much currency. But with gold convertibility suspended, there was no constraint. The government could print as much as it needed. Picture printing presses running day and night, churning out paper money that had no backing except government promises. Germany's monetary expansion was even more dramatic. The German money supply increased from 6 billion marks in 1914 to 45 billion marks by 1918, a sevenfold increase. France saw similar expansion. Russia's money supply increased tenfold before the Bolshevik Revolution eliminated the old monetary system entirely. Across Europe, governments were printing money on a scale never before seen, justified by the emergency of war. The inflation that would result was entirely predictable, but it was a problem for the future. The present demanded money, and money was created. This monetary expansion had predictable effects. Inflation accelerated throughout the war years. Prices in Britain roughly doubled between 1914 and 1918. German prices tripled. French prices more than doubled. The inflation was a form of taxation, reducing the real value of fixed debts and transferring wealth from creditors to debtors. Banks, which were large debtors because of their deposit liabilities, benefited enormously from this inflation. Think about this for a moment. The very institutions that caused the crisis profited from the solution. Their debts were inflated away, while depositors bore the losses. The war provided the perfect excuse for every pre-existing problem on bank balance sheets. Failed colonial loans could now be reframed as patriotic investments in empire defense rather than reckless speculation. Those Ottoman railway loans that were bleeding losses, they became strategic investments in an ally. African colonial ventures that produced no returns. They were resources for the war effort. South American defaults, regrettable but understandable given wartime disruption to trade. Every bad decision was suddenly justified by war necessity. The narrative changed overnight. Illiquidity that had threatened bank collapse was suddenly redefined as supporting national mobilization efforts. Banks weren't insolvent. They were simply directing credit to the war effort. The reserve ratios that had fallen to dangerous levels weren't signs of recklessness. They showed patriotic commitment to financing mobilization. The narrative completely inverted. What had been banking failures became banking contributions to national defense. Failure was rebranded as patriotism. Can you see the genius of this reframing? The banks that nearly destroyed civilization were suddenly heroes supporting the war effort. All the mismanagement and reckless lending of the previous 4 decades was instantly blamed on the war emergency instead of the bankers who had created the crisis. This revisionist history began immediately and has persisted in most historical accounts. The standard narrative says World War I caused economic disruption, including banking difficulties. The reality was precisely the opposite, that banking difficulties were already destroying the system, and the war provided the political cover to implement rescue measures that would have been politically impossible in peacetime. But the real transformation came when governments became captive customers of the banking system. Nations needed immediate massive loans for mobilization, and banks suddenly became the sole source of war financing. This reversed the traditional power relationship. Governments couldn't let banks fail because losing their lenders meant losing the war. Banks gained unprecedented leverage over sovereign debt for the first time in modern history. Let me show you exactly how this power inversion worked, because this is the foundation of the system we still live under today. The mechanism was straightforward. Mobilizing for modern war required immediate spending on scales that tax revenue couldn't match. Governments needed to clothe, feed, arm, and transport millions of soldiers. They needed to purchase weapons, ammunition, vehicles, ships, and aircraft. They needed to build factories, expand ports, construct training facilities. All of this required capital immediately, not years in the future when taxes might produce sufficient revenue. Picture the scale of mobilization. Entire economies had to be restructured in months. Banks became the intermediaries that made this spending possible. British banks lent extraordinary sums to the government in the first year alone, with loans backed by future taxation rather than gold reserves. In the first 6 months of the war, the British government borrowed over £350 million from the banking system. This was more than the entire government budget for a normal peacetime year. The loans were secured not by gold or by current revenue, but by promises of future taxation. Future generations were being obligated without their consent. The banks were creating this money through the normal fractional reserve process, but now backed by government guarantees rather than gold reserves. A bank might lend £10 million to the government by simply crediting the government's account with that sum. The bank didn't need to have £10 million in gold. It just needed confidence that the government would repay the loan with interest. And the government had guaranteed it would through taxation. Can you see the alchemy here? Money was being created from promises, secured by future claims on the population's labour. German banks absorbed government war bonds at preferential rates that guaranteed profits, regardless of the war's outcome. The German government issued war bonds in multiple series throughout 1914 and 1915. Deutsche Bank, Dresdner Bank, and other major institutions purchased these bonds at issue, then resold them to the public at markup. The banks served as underwriters, guaranteed a spread between purchase price and sale price. If the bonds sold well, banks made the spread. If bonds sold poorly, the Reichsbank would purchase them from the private banks at favourable prices, ensuring banks didn't take losses. This created a perfect profit mechanism. Banks lent to the government by purchasing bonds. They then sold those bonds to savers and investors, recovering their capital plus a fee. If they couldn't find buyers, the central bank would buy the bonds, ensuring banks always made money. The risks were entirely socialized. The profits were entirely private. German banks earned hundreds of millions of marks in fees from war bond operations between 1914 and 1918. They were profiting from both sides of every transaction. Heads they win, tails the public loses. French banks restructured their entire portfolios under government emergency powers, converting private losses into public obligations. The French government authorized banks to swap their non-performing private loans for government debt instruments. A bank holding 100 million francs in defaulted loans to Russian companies could exchange these worthless assets for French government bonds worth 100 million francs. The bank's balance sheet was cleaned up. The losses were transferred to French taxpayers. Picture the scale of this operation. Billions in private losses simply disappeared from bank books and reappeared as public debt. This wasn't done transparently. The mechanisms were hidden in emergency decrees and implemented through the Banque de France. The scale of the operation only became apparent years later when historians examined the archives. But by 1916, French banks had exchanged approximately 8 billion francs in bad private debt for government obligations. This represented roughly 30% of France's pre-war national income. The wealth transfer was staggering. An entire generation's productive capacity had been pledged to cover bank losses. American banks, though officially neutral until 1917, financed all sides of the conflict and eliminated any distinction between good and bad loans in the process. J.P. Morgan and Company became the purchasing agent for Britain and France in the United States. The bank arranged loans from American banks to the Allied governments, then used those funds to purchase American goods for shipment to Europe. Morgan earned fees on the loans and commissions on the purchases. Picture the conflict of interest. The same institution advising on loans was profiting from the spending. Between 1914 and 1917, American banks lent approximately $2.3 billion to the Allied powers. This was an enormous sum, representing about 2.5% of American GDP. The loans were unsecured by any collateral beyond promises of repayment. American banks were essentially betting that Britain and France would win the war and be able to repay. If the Allies lost, the loans would be worthless. This gave American banks and the American government a powerful incentive to ensure Allied victory. Financial exposure became a driver of foreign policy. American entry into the war in 1917 was partly a bailout of American banks. While generals planned troop movements, bankers orchestrated something far more permanent: the largest balance sheet laundering operation in modern history. Banks held billions in questionable private debt that had been deteriorating for years: failed railroad ventures, speculative real estate loans, and colonial projects that would never produce returns. These assets were economic dead weight, representing capital that had been misallocated and lost. Under normal circumstances, these losses would destroy the banks that made them. Under normal circumstances, banks would have to write off these losses, reducing their capital and potentially causing insolvency. Shareholders would bear the losses through reduced dividends or complete loss of investment. This is how capitalism is supposed to work. Bad investments get liquidated. Capital gets reallocated to productive uses. The system cleanses itself through bankruptcy and failure, but the war prevented this cleansing process. Instead of failure and renewal, the system got bailout and preservation. The banks that made bad decisions were rescued, not punished. Governments needed liquidity immediately for mobilization and couldn't wait for traditional tax collection processes to generate funds. Raising taxes takes time. Legislatures must debate and pass tax bills. New taxes must be collected through existing administrative machinery. The revenue arrives months or years after the tax is imposed. But governments needed money immediately in August 1914 to mobilize armies and begin fighting. There was no time for the normal fiscal process. Emergency required immediate action, and banks, had the solution ready. Banks offered a solution that served their interests perfectly. They would exchange their risky private loans for newly issued government war bonds. The transformation was elegant in its simplicity and devastating in its consequences. Risk that had been concentrated on bank balance sheets, where shareholders would bear the losses, was transferred to government ledgers, where taxpayers would carry the burden for generations. The mechanism turned private failures into public obligations. Can you see the genius of this from the bank's perspective? Their mistakes became everyone's problem. A bank holding 100 million marks in defaulted Ottoman railway loans would exchange these for 100 million marks in German war bonds. The bank's balance sheet improved immediately. Where it once held a non-performing loan showing zero income, it now held a government bond paying 5% interest. The bank's income increased. Its apparent solvency improved. Its shareholders were protected from losses. But the losses didn't disappear. They were transferred to the German government, which would have to tax its citizens to repay those bonds. The loss was simply moved from bank shareholders to future taxpayers who had no say in the matter. Deutsche Bank's failing Ottoman railway loans, which had been effectively defaulted on before the war, were swapped for German war bonds backed by future reparations, expectations that never materialized. The Deutsche Bank had lent heavily to finance the Baghdad Railway, a project to connect Berlin with the Persian Gulf through Ottoman territory. By 1914, the project was hemorrhaging money. The Ottoman government couldn't pay its obligations. The railway was incomplete and generating no revenue. The loans were worthless. But through the alchemy of war finance, worthless became valuable. During the war, these loans were reclassified as strategic imperial investments. The Deutsche Bank exchanged them for German war bonds. The German government's justification was that the Ottoman Empire was now an ally, and its railways had military value. After the war, Germany expected to extract reparations from defeated enemies that would cover these costs. Of course, Germany lost the war and paid reparations rather than receiving them. The Deutsche Bank's losses became permanent burdens on the German state. The bank was protected. German taxpayers paid the price for decades. British banks converted their massive South American exposure, bleeding losses for years, into what was repackaged as empire defence financing. British banks held approximately £800 million in South American loans by 1914, mostly to Argentina, Brazil and Chile. Many of these loans were in default or near default. Argentina hadn't fully recovered from its 1890 default. Brazilian coffee loans were non-performing due to price collapses. Chilean mining ventures had failed to produce expected returns. These were bad debts that should have been written off, destroying bank capital. During the war, British banks exchanged many of these loans for British war bonds. The justification was that South American resources were needed for the war effort, so financing South America was supporting Britain's war aims. British ships would carry South American beef and grain to feed the population. South American nitrates were needed for explosives. The loans were reframed as strategically important rather than recklessly speculative. Bad judgment was transformed into patriotic necessity. Can you see the pattern? Every failed investment becomes essential to national security during crisis. The Bank of England facilitated these swaps, accepting South American debt instruments as collateral for loans to British banks, then allowing the banks to convert the collateral to war bonds. The mechanism was technically complex, but the result was simple. Bad South American debt disappeared from bank balance sheets and reappeared as British government obligations. Approximately £300 million in South American exposure was laundered through this process between 1914 and 1916. Think about that number. £300 million of losses simply transferred from private balance sheets to public debt, and nobody outside the financial system even knew it was happening. French banks held enormous quantities of Russian loans that would become worthless after the revolution. But during the war, these were transformed into Allied mutual support obligations. French banks and small investors held approximately 12 billion francs in Russian government bonds by 1914. These bonds financed Russian railway construction, military modernization, and general government operations. They paid good interest rates and were considered safe investments backed by the Russian Empire. The faith in Russian bonds was nearly absolute among French savers. When Russia entered the war as France's ally, these loans were folded into the broader Allied financing structure. French banks lent more money to Russia for war purposes, and existing Russian loans were treated as contributions to the Allied cause. When the Bolsheviks seized power in 1917 and repudiated all Tsarist debts, the French holders of Russian bonds lost everything, but French banks had already swapped much of their Russian exposure for French government bonds, protecting themselves from the losses that devastated small investors. The banks knew what was coming and positioned accordingly. They always do. The scale of this operation was staggering when measured against the size of national economies at the time. The British government alone provided some £200 million to banks through various revival schemes, representing roughly 9% of the entire national GDP. In modern terms, this would be equivalent to the US government providing approximately $2 trillion in direct support to banks. The scale of intervention was unprecedented. Nothing like this had been attempted in peacetime. War made the impossible routine. Crisis justified any action. Germany provided similar support proportional to its economy. France redirected a significant portion of its borrowing into bank support. Even neutral countries like the Netherlands and Switzerland saw their governments provide support to domestic banks affected by the crisis. The pattern was universal. Governments everywhere stepped in to prevent banking collapse, and the cost was borne by future generations of taxpayers who had no voice in the decision. Democracy was suspended for banking rescue. The unborn were obligated to pay for the mistakes of bankers they would never meet. This was state intervention in the financial system on what contemporaries described as a hitherto unimaginable scale. Britain had a long tradition of limited government and free markets. The idea that government would directly support private businesses was alien to Victorian liberal philosophy. Germany had a more statist tradition, but even there, the scale of intervention shocked observers. France combined republicanism with economic liberalism, and the banking support measures contradicted both philosophies. Every principle was abandoned when banks needed rescue. But the crisis and the war made philosophical objections irrelevant. The choice was simple. Either governments rescued the banks, or the banks would fail and take the entire economy with them. There was no third option. The gold standard and fractional reserve banking had created a system where banks were so central to economic function that their failure would cause civilizational collapse. Governments had to act regardless of their philosophical preferences. Ideology bowed to necessity, and necessity served banking interests. Banks emerged from 1914 and 1915 with cleaner balance sheets than they had maintained in 2 decades, with new accounting standards introduced under war emergency rules, allowing creative categorization of assets. Before the war, banks had to report assets at market value or at cost, whichever was lower. This meant that when asset values fell, banks had to recognize losses immediately. The new wartime accounting rules changed this fundamentally. Suddenly, losses could be hidden indefinitely. Assets could now be carried at par value, regardless of market prices. Government bonds were always valued at 100% of face value, even if they traded at 80% in the market. Commercial loans could be valued at original principal plus accrued interest, even if the borrower was in default. Securities of allied nations could be carried at pre-war values, even if those nations faced fiscal crisis. The accounting fictions made banks look solvent on paper while hiding massive underlying losses. Appearance replaced reality as the measure of soundness. These wartime emergency accounting measures were supposed to be temporary. They became permanent. The accounting standards introduced between 1914 and 1916 remained in place throughout the 1920s and shaped banking regulation for decades. The idea that banks could value assets at something other than market prices became accepted practice. This created the foundation for the accounting games that would contribute to the 2008 financial crisis nearly a century later. The precedent set in 1914 echoes through every subsequent crisis. Emergency measures become permanent tools of deception. The cost was borne by those who had no voice in the transaction. Future taxpayers were committed to debts they never agreed to assume and had no role in creating. A person born in 1920 would spend their entire working life paying taxes to service debts incurred between 1914 and 1918. They had no vote in 1914. They made no decisions about bank bailouts or war finance, but they would pay for those decisions through reduced government services, higher taxes, and diminished economic opportunity. Democracy only applies to the living. The unborn have no representation. This intergenerational theft was hidden in the complexity of government finance. Citizens in 1914 saw their governments borrow money for the war effort. They didn't realize they were also assuming the bad debts of the banking system. The true cost of the bank bailout was buried in the overall cost of the war. When people looked at Britain's national debt in 1920, they assumed it was all war costs. They didn't know that perhaps 20% represented bailouts of banks that should have failed in 1914. The numbers told a lie through omission. Inflation transferred wealth systematically from savers to banking institutions as currency expanded to accommodate war financing. Inflation is a form of taxation, but it's hidden and regressive. When governments print money, they create inflation that reduces the purchasing power of existing currency. Someone who held £100 in 1914 would find that by 1918, those pounds could buy only half as much. Their real wealth had been cut in half by inflation. Picture a worker who had saved for decades, watching their life savings evaporate through no fault of their own. Banks benefited from this inflation because they were net debtors. Banks owe money to depositors. When inflation reduces the real value of money, banks can repay deposits with currency that's worth less than when the deposits were made. A depositor who put 100 gold-backed pounds in a bank in 1914 would get back 100 inflated paper pounds in 1918. Nominally, they received their full deposit. In real terms, they lost half their wealth. The bank effectively confiscated half the deposit through inflation. And this wasn't an accident. It was the design. The scale of this wealth transfer was enormous. Britain's money supply increased by 84% during the war. German money supply increased sevenfold. This inflation transferred billions in real wealth from savers to institutions that benefited from currency debasement. Banks, governments, and debtors gained. Savers, pensioners, and holders of fixed income assets lost. The inflation was a massive redistribution of wealth from the frugal to the profligate. Virtue was punished. Recklessness was rewarded. And the pattern would repeat in every subsequent crisis. Currency devaluation enriched debtors. The banks holding government bonds at the direct expense of creditors who had trusted the system with their deposits. This was the final mechanism of wealth transfer. Before the war, government bonds were considered the safest investment. They paid fixed interest rates in gold-backed currency. A British consul paying 3% was considered as safe as gold itself. Wealthy families held government bonds as permanent investments, living off the interest income. These families had done everything right according to the rules. The suspension of the gold standard and subsequent inflation destroyed these investments. A bond that paid £3 per year in 1914 still paid £3 per year in 1918, but those pounds were worth half as much. The bondholder's real income had been cut in half by inflation. Meanwhile, banks holding government bonds issued during the war were getting the benefit. They lent inflated paper currency to governments and would be repaid in even more inflated currency, earning the interest spread while real value eroded. The institutions that caused the crisis profited from every stage of the solution, always. But one institution saw the war coming and positioned accordingly. The Federal Reserve Act was passed on December 23, 1913, during the holiday recess when congressional opposition was at its minimum. The timing of this legislation is remarkable. After decades of resistance to central banking in America, Congress suddenly created the Federal Reserve System just months before World War I began. The official reason was to prevent panics like the one that had occurred in 1907. But let me show you what the timing suggests about the real reasons. Paul Warburg, the principal architect of the Federal Reserve, had been warning about systemic fragility since arriving in America from Germany in 1902. His proposals for a central bank were initially dismissed as un-American and dangerous. Americans remembered the battles over the first and second banks of the United States. Central banking was politically toxic, but after the panic of 1907 nearly destroyed the American banking system, opposition weakened. The National Monetary Commission, created in 1908 to study banking reform, spent years developing proposals. By 1913, the political will finally existed to act. The Federal Reserve Act passed the House on December 22, 1913, by a vote of 298 to 60. It passed the Senate the next day, December 23, by a vote of 43 to 25. President Woodrow Wilson signed it into law that same evening. The speed of final passage was striking. Such a fundamental change to the American financial system was rushed through Congress during the holiday recess. Many congressmen weren't even present for the vote. They had left Washington for Christmas vacation. Think about the optics. The most important financial legislation in American history was passed when most representatives were absent. By August 1914, exactly when war mobilization required massive lending capacity, the Federal Reserve was operational and ready to serve. The Federal Reserve banks opened for business on November 16, 1914. War had begun in Europe in August. The European financial system was in crisis. The American banking system faced stress from European credit markets freezing. And suddenly, America had a central bank with the power to create unlimited liquidity, perfectly positioned to respond to the crisis. The timing was either remarkably fortunate or carefully planned. What do you think? The key architects of this new central banking system, Paul Warburg, partners from the House of Morgan and members of Kuhn Loeb, all maintained deep ties to the European banking operations that were experiencing the crisis firsthand. Paul Warburg's brother Max was a prominent German banker. J.P. Morgan had extensive operations in London. Kuhn Loeb had connections to German and British finance. These men weren't just designing an American central bank. They were creating an institution that could support the entire transatlantic financial system. They understood the fragility because they had intimate knowledge of both sides of the Atlantic. What the Federal Reserve enabled transformed American banking in ways that seemed almost designed for the crisis ahead. The elastic currency provision meant banks could now expand the money supply without gold backing, eliminating the constraint that had threatened European institutions. Before the Federal Reserve, American money supply was limited by gold reserves held by banks. If banks needed more currency, they had to acquire more gold. This made the system rigid and prone to liquidity crises. The gold straitjacket that was strangling European banks didn't exist in America after November 1914. The Federal Reserve changed this fundamentally. Federal Reserve notes could be issued against commercial paper, government bonds, or gold. Banks could bring commercial loans to the Fed, discount them, and receive Federal Reserve notes in exchange. This meant the money supply could expand to meet the needs of commerce without requiring more gold. The constraint that had strangled European banking was removed in America just months before it would have become critical. Can you see how perfectly timed this was? The solution was in place exactly when the problem reached crisis. The lender of last resort function gave banks somewhere to turn instead of facing liquidity death when depositors demanded their funds. In previous crises, when depositors rushed to withdraw funds, banks had nowhere to turn for additional liquidity. They either had enough cash on hand to meet withdrawals, or they failed. The Federal Reserve changed this by standing ready to lend to banks that faced temporary liquidity problems. A bank experiencing a run could borrow from the Fed, pay out depositors, and survive the crisis. Bank runs were no longer fatal. This eliminated the primary mechanism that had killed banks in previous panics. Bank runs had been fatal because banks couldn't raise liquidity fast enough. The Fed solved this problem by promising unlimited liquidity to solvent institutions. In theory, this would prevent runs from starting because depositors would know the bank could always meet withdrawals. In practice, it meant banks could take more risks, knowing the Federal Reserve would rescue them if problems developed. Moral hazard was being institutionalized at the very foundation of the American financial system. The discount window allowed troubled assets to be temporarily stored at the Fed rather than forcing banks to recognize losses immediately. Banks could bring loans to the Fed's discount window, receive cash, and temporarily remove the loans from their balance sheets. If the loans later went bad, the Fed bore the losses, not the private banks. This was a mechanism for socializing risk while privatizing profits. Banks made loans knowing they could offload the risky ones to the Federal Reserve if necessary. Picture a casino where you keep your winnings, but the house covers your losses. That's what they created. The Fed's war financing role began almost immediately, despite official American neutrality. Federal Reserve officials coordinated American bank loans to Britain and France, providing the liquidity that allowed those governments to continue fighting. This was technically legal, despite American neutrality, because the Fed was lending to American banks, which then lent to the Allies. But the economic effect was identical to direct Fed lending to foreign governments. American neutrality was a legal fiction. The financial reality was Allied support from the beginning. Benjamin Strong, the first governor of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, worked closely with the Bank of England throughout the war to maintain credit flows between America and Britain. Strong and Montague Norman, who would become governor of the Bank of England in 1920, established a relationship during the war years that would shape international finance for decades. They coordinated interest rate policies, managed gold flows, and ensured that credit remained available for trade despite the disruptions of war. These weren't elected officials. They were bankers controlling national policy through personal relationships. The Fed managed gold flows carefully to prevent domestic banking strain, while enabling massive lending overseas. When the Allies needed to purchase American goods, they needed dollars. They obtained these dollars by shipping gold to New York or by borrowing from American banks. The Federal Reserve managed this process to ensure that gold flows didn't drain reserves from American banks or create inflationary pressure. It was a delicate balancing act that required the Fed to coordinate with the Treasury, with major banks, and with allied central banks. The complexity was staggering, but the execution was nearly flawless. By the time America entered the war in 1917, Fed member banks held roughly $2.5 billion in Allied obligations, amounts so large that letting the Allies lose would have meant catastrophic bank failures across America. This debt created a powerful incentive structure. American banks had lent billions to Britain and France based on the assumption they would win the war. If Germany won, those loans would be worthless. American banks would face massive losses that could destroy the banking system. Think about what this means. Financial exposure became a driver of foreign policy. The bank's bad bets required American military intervention to protect them. This gave banks and their representatives in government a strong incentive to ensure Allied victory. When President Wilson asked Congress to declare war on Germany in April 1917, he cited German submarine warfare and threats to American shipping. But beneath these justifications was an economic reality. American banks had such enormous exposure to Allied debt that American entry into the war had become a financial necessity. The loans had to be protected, and that required Allied victory. Can you see how financial interests shaped grand strategy? The decision to send millions to war was partly a bank bailout in disguise. The convenience of this timing was remarkable. The Fed's creators had claimed it would prevent panics, like the one in 1907. The war immediately proved its value by enabling unlimited bank bailout capacity. Within less than a year of opening, the Federal Reserve was performing exactly the crisis management functions that had required private intervention by J.P. Morgan in 1907. But now, the intervention was institutionalized, funded by taxpayers through the federal government, and unlimited in scale. One man's emergency action had become a permanent government function with unlimited resources. The Federal Reserve was designed to do exactly what it did in 1914 through 1918. Provide unlimited liquidity to prevent banking collapse and finance government borrowing on unprecedented scales. Whether the designers consciously anticipated World War I is unknowable, but they certainly anticipated some crisis that would require massive intervention. The Fed's structure and powers were perfectly suited to the crisis that materialized less than 8 months after it opened. That perfection of timing and design is remarkable, perhaps too remarkable to be coincidence. What was sold as a temporary emergency measure never ended. It became the permanent architecture of American finance. The Federal Reserve was supposed to be a lender of last resort, used only in emergencies. In practice, it became the permanent manager of American credit and monetary policy. The emergency powers granted in 1914 were never rescinded. The suspension of gold convertibility that was supposed to be temporary became permanent in 1933. The model established during World War I became the template for all future crisis response. Stay with me, because we're about to see how this pattern transformed the entire structure of power. When the armistice was signed in November 1918, the banking system that emerged looked nothing like the one that had been collapsing in 1914. Institutions that should have failed during the pre-war crisis now dominated their governments rather than serving them. The power relationships had completely inverted. Before the war, governments regulated banks, set monetary policy, and controlled credit creation within the constraints of the gold standard. After the war, banks effectively controlled governments through debt. Picture the relationship flipped upside down. The servant became the master. Banks that survived didn't just recover. They emerged as monopolies after smaller competitors failed or were absorbed during the war years. The war created perfect conditions for banking consolidation. Smaller banks that couldn't access government support failed or were acquired by larger institutions that had government backing. Regional banks that served local communities were absorbed by national institutions with political connections. The competitive banking system of the pre-war era became an oligopoly of major institutions. Competition was replaced by cartel-like cooperation among a handful of giants. In Britain, the banking system consolidated dramatically from 38 major institutions in 1913 to just 5 dominant banks by 1920: Barclays, Lloyds, Midland, National Provincial, and Westminster. These Big Five would control British finance for generations. They had emerged from the war stronger than their competitors because of their size, their government connections, and their ability to access rescue funds that smaller banks couldn't obtain. The consolidation was presented as a natural evolution toward more efficient banking. In reality, it was the result of selective government support that favored the largest institutions. Germany saw similar consolidation. The D banks, Deutsche Bank, Dresdner Bank, Darmstädter Bank, and Diskontogesellschaft, emerged from the war, controlling the vast majority of German banking assets. Smaller regional banks had failed or been absorbed. The major banks had direct access to Reichsbank support and to government war financing contracts that generated enormous fees. They emerged from the war as too big to fail institutions that governments couldn't regulate effectively without risking systemic crisis. The banks had become larger than the state's ability to control them. Government debt dependence had fundamentally reversed the traditional power relationship, making sovereigns subordinate to their creditors for the first time in the modern era. This was the critical transformation. Before the war, governments were independent actors that could regulate banks, tax them, or even seize their assets if necessary. After the war, governments owed so much money to banks that they couldn't take any actions that might harm their creditors. Debt became chains binding government policy. Democracy was subordinated to creditor interests. British government debt increased from £650 million in 1914 to £7.4 billion in 1919, an 11-fold increase. Most of this debt was held by British banks and investors who had purchased war bonds. The government now depended on banks to continuously roll over this debt by purchasing new bonds as old ones matured. If banks refused to buy government bonds, the government would face default. This gave banks veto power over government policy. Imagine trying to regulate an institution that could destroy your government by refusing to buy your bonds. France faced even more severe debt dependence. French government debt increased from 33 billion francs in 1913 to 173 billion francs in 1919. The ratio of debt to GDP exceeded 150%, one of the highest levels in French history. Servicing this debt required approximately 25% of all government revenue. The French government was trapped, unable to pursue policies that banks opposed because it needed bank cooperation to finance the debt. Picture a quarter of all taxes going just to pay interest to bankers. That's not governance, that's tribute. Germany's debt burden was catastrophic. German government debt reached 144 billion marks by 1919, plus reparations obligations that would eventually total 132 billion marks. The German government was insolvent by any reasonable measure, but collapse would destroy the banking system that held government bonds. Banks and government were locked in a mutual dependency where neither could survive the failure of the other. This made effective regulation impossible and set the stage for the hyperinflation of 1923. The entire system was built on the fiction of eventual repayment that everyone knew was impossible. The transformation of power was complete and permanent. Before the war, governments had regulated banks and dictated the terms of financial operations. After the war, banks dictated terms to governments, demanding austerity measures, controlling reparations, structures, and determining reconstruction loan conditions. This inversion shaped global politics for decades and created the foundation for the financial architecture we live with today. Democracy had been subordinated to financial power, and most people never even noticed it happening. The Bank of England forced Britain to return to the gold standard in 1925, specifically to protect bank creditor interests, even though the policy devastated employment and industrial production. Winston Churchill, serving as Chancellor of the Exchequer, made the decision to return to gold at the pre-war parity of $4.86 per pound. This required deflation and high interest rates to strengthen the pound to its pre-war value. The policy was economically disastrous, but financially orthodox. It benefited banks at the expense of everyone else. The return to gold was demanded by the banking community because it protected the real value of debt. Banks held government bonds and private loans denominated in pounds. If the pound was devalued, these debts would be repaid in cheaper currency, harming creditors. Returning to gold at the pre-war parity maintained the real value of debt. benefiting creditors at the expense of debtors, workers, and industry. Unemployment in Britain remained elevated throughout the 1920s as a direct result of this policy. An entire generation of workers sacrificed to protect bank balance sheets. Churchill later admitted this was one of the greatest mistakes of his career. But in 1925, he had little choice. The Bank of England, the major banks, and the financial community demanded the return to gold. They threatened financial crisis if the government didn't comply. Churchill chose financial stability over economic growth, prioritizing bank interests over industrial workers. This pattern would repeat in Britain and across Europe for decades, governments sacrificing economic welfare to protect financial interests. Policy was captured by the very institutions it was supposed to regulate. What had been sold as temporary emergency powers became the normalized structure of modern finance. The suspension of the gold standard was never fully restored to pre-war conditions. Britain returned to gold in 1925, but abandoned it permanently in 1931 during the Great Depression. The United States formally abandoned the gold standard for domestic purposes in 1933 and for international purposes in 1971. The emergency suspension of 1914 became the permanent fiat currency system we live with today. What was presented as temporary became eternal. Do you see the pattern? Government debt levels remained at wartime multiples throughout the 1920s and beyond. Debt that was supposed to be temporary war financing became permanent structural debt. Governments discovered they could finance operations through borrowing rather than taxation. This gave them greater flexibility, but also made them dependent on banks and bond markets. The high debt levels of the post-war period established a new normal where government debt exceeding 50% of GDP was considered acceptable rather than alarming. Perpetual debt became a feature of modern government, not a bug. Central bank independence, which really meant banker control of monetary policy without government oversight, became the accepted doctrine. Before the war, central banks in most countries were formally or effectively controlled by governments. After the war, the doctrine of central bank independence spread globally. The idea was that monetary policy should be made by technical experts insulated from political pressure. In practice, this meant banks controlled monetary policy in their own interests. Think about that. The institutions being regulated controlled the regulators. The Bank of England gained de facto independence from the Treasury during the 1920s. The Reichsbank's independence was enshrined in the Dawes Plan of 1924. The Federal Reserve in America was designed to be independent from its creation. This independence meant central banks set interest rates, controlled credit creation, and managed currency values without meaningful democratic oversight. Banking interests controlled the institutions that regulated banking, a perfect example of regulatory capture. The fox was guarding the henhouse, and everyone pretended this was sound policy. The too big to fail concept was firmly established, making major banks effectively untouchable regardless of their behavior. The precedent had been set in 1914. When major banks faced collapse, governments rescued them because allowing failure would cause systemic crisis. This created moral hazard on a grand scale. Banks learned they could take enormous risks because profits were privatized, but losses were socialized. This lesson would be applied repeatedly throughout the 20th century. Every crisis reinforced the lesson. Big banks don't fail, they get rescued. The winners of this transformation could be measured in concrete numbers. JP Morgan and Company saw its assets grow from roughly $550 million in 1913 to $1.2 billion by 1919. The bank had been instrumental in arranging allied financing, earning fees on billions in loans. It had served as purchasing agent for Britain and France, earning commissions on goods purchased. It had coordinated American entry into the war financing system. The bank's profits and power grew enormously during years that devastated millions of ordinary people. War was very good for banking. Federal Reserve member banks in America tripled their deposit base during the war years. The Federal Reserve System had 7,600 member banks by 1920, holding combined deposits of approximately $14 billion, up from $5 billion in 1914. These banks had exclusive access to the Fed's discount window and to the liquidity support that made expansion possible. Non-member banks struggled to compete and gradually lost market share, or were acquired by member institutions. The system was designed to favor the insiders from the beginning. The largest American banks grew even faster than the system average. National City Bank, Bank of America, Chase National Bank, and others saw their assets multiply during the war years. They financed Allied purchases, underwrote government bonds, and expanded internationally as European banks withdrew from global markets. American banks emerged from World War I as global institutions for the first time, challenging British dominance of international finance. The war redistributed global financial power, and American banks were the primary beneficiaries. The losers bore costs that would compound for decades. Citizens holding pre-war currency savings watched inflation destroy 50 to 90% of their purchasing power across Europe. A German worker who had saved 10,000 marks by 1914, enough to buy a house, found that by 1920, those marks might buy a bicycle. The savings of a lifetime were destroyed by inflation. British savers fared better, but still lost approximately half their purchasing power. French savers saw similar losses. Picture the betrayal. People who had done everything right, who had saved and been prudent, lost everything. The inflation was a form of wealth confiscation, but it was hidden and gradual enough that most people didn't understand what was happening to them. They knew prices were rising. They knew their money bought less, but they didn't connect this to government policy and bank bailouts. They blamed the war or profiteers or foreign enemies. The actual mechanisms of wealth transfer remained invisible to most people, understood only by financial insiders. The theft was executed in plain sight, but the victims couldn't see it. They still can't. Thousands of small regional banks failed or were absorbed by the giants. In America, approximately 500 banks failed between 1914 and 1920, most of them small community banks that couldn't access Federal Reserve support effectively or couldn't compete with larger institutions that had government connections. In Germany, hundreds of small regional banks disappeared through failure or acquisition. In Britain, the consolidation was even more dramatic, with most regional banks disappearing entirely. Local banking, responsive to community needs, was replaced by distant corporate bureaucracy. These small banks had served local communities, lending to local businesses and farmers based on personal relationships and local knowledge. Their disappearance meant communities lost access to credit tailored to their needs. The large banks that replaced them made lending decisions based on standardized criteria from distant headquarters. This centralization of credit decision-making changed the character of banking from a local relationship business to a bureaucratic industry. Banking became impersonal, standardized, and unresponsive to local needs. Entire nations found themselves perpetually indebted to a banking system that had been on the verge of collapse just years earlier. The paradox was complete. Banks that should have failed in 1914 now controlled the governments that had rescued them. Nations that had saved their banking systems from collapse were now subordinate to those same institutions. The power inversion was total and seemingly permanent. The institutions that had nearly destroyed civilization through their recklessness now held civilization hostage through debt. And this arrangement continues to this day. Germany's debt burden, combined with reparations, created economic instability that persisted for decades and contributed to the rise of extremism. The country was trapped between unpayable debts to foreign creditors and reparations obligations to the Allies. Every mark collected in taxes had to be divided between domestic creditors, foreign creditors, and government operations. There wasn't enough revenue to satisfy all claims. Something had to give. The system was mathematically unsustainable from the start. What gave was the currency itself. Germany chose to inflate rather than default. The government printed marks to pay its debts, causing the value of the mark to collapse. The hyperinflation of 1923 destroyed the German middle class, wiping out savings and pensions. Workers saw their wages become worthless between morning and evening. The social fabric tore apart as economic chaos made normal life impossible. This created the conditions that made extremist political movements attractive. Economic desperation breeds political radicalization. The bankers who created the crisis bore no consequences. The German people paid the price. France's debt situation, though less extreme than Germany's, still constrained French policy throughout the 1920s and contributed to the political instability that weakened the country before World War II. France had borrowed heavily from Britain and America during the war. It also held enormous quantities of Russian bonds that became worthless after the Bolshevik Revolution. The French government was caught between foreign creditors demanding repayment and domestic voters demanding social spending. There was no way to satisfy both. The debt made sound governance impossible. France attempted to solve this problem by extracting reparations from Germany. French policy toward Germany throughout the 1920s was driven primarily by the need to obtain reparations to service French debts. When Germany couldn't or wouldn't pay, France occupied the Ruhr industrial region in 1923 in an attempt to seize resources directly. This failed and further destabilized both countries. The debt trap created by World War I financing poisoned European politics for a generation. The economics of the peace guaranteed the next war. Britain's debt to America, combined with its own domestic debt burden, forced austerity policies that kept unemployment high throughout the 1920s. The British government owed approximately £850 million to the United States by 1920. It also owed approximately £7 billion to domestic creditors. Servicing this debt required raising taxes and cutting spending. The result was persistent economic stagnation, despite Britain's victory in the war. Victory felt like defeat for ordinary Britons who suffered unemployment and poverty while bankers prospered. British workers suffered high unemployment throughout the 1920s. Industrial production remained below pre-war levels. Exports declined as the overvalued pound made British goods expensive in international markets. The return to the gold standard at pre-war parity, demanded by the banking community, made all of this worse. Britain's economy was sacrificed to maintain the value of debts owed to bankers and bondholders. The real economy served the financial economy, not the other way around. This inverted priority structure persists today. The pattern established in 1914 didn't disappear after the war ended. It became the template for every major financial crisis that followed. The crisis response consolidation cycle repeats with remarkable consistency across different eras. The mechanism is so reliable it appears almost scripted. Every major crisis follows the same pattern: a period of expansion and speculation, a crash that threatens major institutions, emergency measures that rescue banks at public expense, and consolidation that leaves banks more powerful than before. Once you see the pattern, you can't unsee it. It's happening right now. In 1914, war emergency led to gold suspension, bank bailouts, and permanent system expansion. The gold standard was suspended. Government guarantees flowed to banks. Bad debts were transferred to government balance sheets, and new money was printed in massive quantities. When the crisis ended, none of these measures were fully reversed. The emergency became the new normal. Banks emerged stronger and governments emerged weaker. This would be the template going forward. Every crisis follows this script. In 2008, the financial crisis triggered TARP bailouts, quantitative easing programs, and even bigger banks emerging stronger than before. The parallels to 1914 are exact. When major banks faced collapse due to bad loans and excessive leverage, Government stepped in with emergency measures. The Troubled Asset Relief Program provided $700 billion in direct support. The Federal Reserve's quantitative easing added trillions to bank reserves. Bad assets were removed from bank balance sheets and transferred to government accounts. Does this sound familiar? It should. It's the same playbook. The official story was that these were temporary measures to prevent systemic collapse. In reality, they were permanent wealth transfers from taxpayers to bank shareholders. TARP was supposedly repaid, but the opportunity cost was never recovered. The Federal Reserve's balance sheet expanded from under $1 trillion in 2007 to over $4.5 trillion by 2015. This represented assets purchased from banks at inflated prices, removing toxic debt from private balance sheets and placing it on the public ledger. The 1914 playbook, executed with modern financial instruments. The largest banks that survived 2008 emerged even larger through acquisition of failed competitors. JP Morgan Chase acquired Bear Stearns and Washington Mutual. Bank of America acquired Merrill Lynch and Countrywide Financial. Wells Fargo acquired Wachovia. The crisis that should have broken up the too big to fail banks instead made them bigger and more systemically important. The pattern from 1914 repeated exactly. Crisis leads to consolidation, leads to greater concentration of power. The banks that caused the crisis benefited most from the solution. Always. In 2020, the pandemic response brought unlimited Federal Reserve lending, trillions in bank support, and asset price inflation that transferred wealth upward. When COVID-19 shut down large portions of the economy, the Federal Reserve responded with unprecedented intervention. Interest rates went to zero. The Fed began purchasing corporate bonds for the first time in its history. Congress authorized trillions in spending. The money supply expanded by over 25% in a single year. Picture money creation on a scale that would have been unimaginable just years earlier. This massive intervention prevented immediate economic collapse, but created enormous asset inflation. Stock markets reached all-time highs, while unemployment reached depression levels. Housing prices surged despite economic uncertainty. The wealthy, who own most financial assets, saw their wealth increase dramatically. Workers and savers saw their purchasing power eroded by inflation. The pattern was identical to 1914 to 1918, emergency measures that rescue financial assets at the expense of currency holders. The mechanism changes, but the effect remains constant. Wealth flows upward during every crisis. The mechanisms employed are functionally identical across all three events. Normal rules get suspended during the declared emergency. Whether it's gold convertibility in 1914 or traditional Fed lending limits in 2020, the playbook is the same. Emergency declarations allow authorities to bypass normal legal and political constraints. Actions that would be impossible during normal times become acceptable during crisis. Once implemented, emergency measures become permanent features of the system. Crisis is opportunity for institutional power expansion. Never let a crisis go to waste. Private losses are transferred to public balance sheets through bailouts disguised as systemic stability measures. The language is always about preventing collapse, protecting depositors, ensuring stability. The reality is always about protecting bank shareholders and bondholders from losses they should bear. The mechanism varies in technical details, but the effect is identical. Private risks are socialized, while private profits remain private. This is the fundamental transaction underlying every modern financial crisis. Heads they win, tails you lose. In 1914, banks exchanged bad loans for government bonds. In 2008, the Fed purchased toxic mortgage securities at inflated prices. In 2020, the Fed purchased corporate bonds and expanded support to non-banks. The specific instruments differ, but the transaction is the same. Troubled private assets are removed from private balance sheets and placed on public balance sheets, with taxpayers ultimately bearing the costs. The names change, the instruments evolve, but the wealth transfer remains constant, from the many to the few. Central bank powers expand permanently under temporary emergency authorities that somehow never expire. The Federal Reserve was created in 1913 as a lender of last resort to be used only in extreme emergencies. By 1920, it was actively managing monetary policy and credit creation. After 2008, it began purchasing long-term government bonds and mortgage securities, activities that would have been considered beyond its mandate just years earlier. After 2020, it was purchasing corporate bonds and explicitly targeting asset prices. Each crisis expands the mandate. The ratchet only turns one direction. Each expansion of authority is justified as a temporary emergency measure, but the authority is never rescinded after the emergency ends. Instead, it becomes accepted practice and the basis for further expansion during the next crisis. The ratchet only turns one direction. Central banks become more powerful with each crisis, accumulating authorities that transform them from emergency lenders into permanent managers of credit, currency, and asset prices. Power once gained is never voluntarily surrendered. The next crisis will expand powers even further. Industry consolidation occurs through selective rescue operations where big banks get saved while smaller competitors are absorbed or fail. This pattern is invariable across all three crises. In 1914, the largest banks received government support and absorbed smaller competitors. In 2008, the largest banks received TARP funds and Fed support, while thousands of smaller banks failed. In 2020, large banks had easy access to Fed facilities while small businesses struggled to access paycheck protection funds. Size determines survival. Connection determines support. The system favors the giants by design. The rhetoric is always about saving the system, but the practice is always about saving specific institutions. If the goal were truly systemic stability, interventions could be structured to support all institutions equally. Instead, support flows primarily to the largest, most politically connected institutions. The result is predictable consolidation that leaves markets more concentrated and dominated by fewer, larger firms. Each crisis is a culling that eliminates the weak and rewards the connected. Competition decreases while concentration increases. The specific modern parallels reveal how little has actually changed in over a century. In 2008, the Federal Reserve took $4.5 trillion in toxic assets onto its balance sheet, functioning exactly like the World War I war bond swaps. Banks holding mortgage-backed securities that had collapsed in value couldn't sell them without recognizing massive losses. The Fed solved this problem by purchasing the securities at prices well above market value. Does this remind you of anything we discussed earlier? It should. It's the same mechanism with different instruments. This removed the toxic assets from bank balance sheets, replacing them with cash and Federal Reserve reserves. Banks' balance sheets improved immediately. Their capital ratios recovered. They could resume lending and paying dividends. The losses didn't disappear. They were transferred to the Federal Reserve's balance sheet and ultimately to taxpayers who backed the Fed. The mechanism was technically different from 1914, but economically identical. Bad private debts became public obligations. The scam was repeated nearly a century later, using more sophisticated language, but the same basic structure. The scale was proportionally similar to World War I bailouts. The Fed's balance sheet expansion represented approximately 30% of US GDP, similar to the roughly 9% of British GDP that went to bank support in 1914. Adjusted for the larger financial sector in the modern economy, the interventions were comparable. Both represented the largest bank bailouts in the history of their respective eras. The numbers are different, but the proportions are remarkably similar. The playbook scales, but doesn't fundamentally change. During 2020, the Federal Reserve directly purchased corporate bonds for the first time, breaking traditional limits that had theoretically constrained central bank intervention. The Dodd-Frank Act, passed after the 2008 crisis, was supposed to prevent future bailouts by limiting Fed lending to solvent institutions and requiring adequate collateral. But in March 2020, the Fed announced programs to purchase corporate bonds, both newly issued and on the secondary market. Emergency again trumped law. Rules dissolved when banks needed rescue. This meant the Fed was directly financing corporations, something it had never done before. The justification was pandemic emergency and market dysfunction. The reality was that corporate bond markets were freezing because investors realized many corporations were over-leveraged and facing potential bankruptcy. Rather than allow the market to clear, the Fed intervened to prevent prices from falling, essentially guaranteeing that corporate bondholders would not face losses. Market discipline was abolished. Moral hazard was maximized. Every asset now has an implicit government guarantee. This established a new precedent. If corporate bondholders can be rescued by the Fed, then all financial assets have an implicit government guarantee. This creates enormous moral hazard. Investors can take maximum risk knowing the Fed will intervene if things go wrong. This incentivizes exactly the kind of leverage and speculation that creates financial instability. The pattern from 1914 continues. Each crisis expands the scope of bailouts, encouraging more risk-taking that creates the next crisis. The system feeds on its own failures. Instability is the business model. Current bank failures like Silicon Valley Bank and First Republic resulted in further consolidation among the largest institutions rather than any meaningful reform. In March 2023, Silicon Valley Bank failed after a run by depositors who realized the bank had massive unrealized losses on its bond portfolio. This was followed by failures of Signature Bank and First Republic Bank. The banking system faced its most significant crisis since 2008. And once again, the response followed the established pattern from 1914. The government response was immediate and massive. The FDIC guaranteed all deposits at failed banks, even those above the $250,000 insurance limit. The Federal Reserve created a new lending facility allowing banks to borrow against their bond holdings at par value, ignoring market losses. These interventions prevented broader contagion but at enormous cost. The implicit guarantee was made explicit. All deposits at all banks are now effectively guaranteed, regardless of insurance limits. The moral hazard ratcheted up another notch. Risk has been completely socialized. The failed banks were not liquidated. They were acquired by larger institutions. JP Morgan Chase acquired First Republic Bank. The assets of Silicon Valley Bank were split between a new bridge bank and various acquirers. Signature Bank was acquired by New York Community Bank. The pattern held. Crisis leads to consolidation, leads to even larger too-big-to-fail institutions. Each crisis makes the banking system more concentrated and more dangerous. We're building toward a system where perhaps 3 or 4 mega banks control everything. And that's exactly what they want. What bankers learned in 1914 shaped financial crisis management for generations. Large-scale crises create permission for actions that would be unthinkable during normal times. The lesson was clear. If you want to implement policies that would normally face strong opposition, wait for or create a crisis. Emergency declarations allow authorities to bypass normal political processes, legal constraints, and public resistance. Actions taken during crisis become precedents for future interventions. Never let a crisis go to waste. Crisis is opportunity. In 1914, the suspension of the gold standard would have been politically impossible during peacetime. It represented a fundamental breach of contract between governments and their citizens. Currency holders were promised gold convertibility. That promise was broken. But war emergency made the breach acceptable. By the time the war ended, suspension of gold convertibility had become normalized, and returning to gold was treated as optional rather than obligatory. The temporary became permanent through crisis. This is the standard playbook. In 2008, direct government purchases of bank equity would have been considered socialism during normal times. The idea that taxpayers would become shareholders in private banks violated free market principles that both major American political parties claimed to support. But crisis made it acceptable. TARP explicitly included provisions for the government to take equity stakes in banks. This represented a fundamental shift in the relationship between government and finance, but crisis made it politically feasible. Principles are flexible during panic. Everything is negotiable in an emergency. In 2020, direct Fed purchases of corporate bonds crossed a line that had been considered absolute. The Federal Reserve was supposed to be a lender of last resort for banks, not a buyer of corporate debt. But pandemic emergency made it acceptable. Once the precedent is set, it becomes available for future use. The next crisis will push boundaries even further because each intervention expands the range of acceptable actions. The Overton window of bailout possibilities keeps expanding. What was unthinkable yesterday becomes routine tomorrow. The public accepts temporary measures that quietly become permanent fixtures of the system. This is perhaps the most important lesson from 1914. Emergency measures are always described as temporary. They're necessary to address immediate crisis, but will be withdrawn once conditions normalize. This makes them politically acceptable. If people knew the measures were permanent, they would resist more strongly. But temporary measures slide into permanent policy through institutional inertia and vested interests. The temporary tax becomes permanent. The emergency power becomes routine authority. And no one seems to notice or care. The suspension of gold convertibility in 1914 was supposed to be temporary, lasting only until the war ended. But returning to gold proved difficult because it required fiscal discipline and austerity that governments found painful. When Britain returned to gold in 1925, the policy was so economically damaging it had to be abandoned in 1931. The United States formally abandoned gold for domestic use in 1933 and for international use in 1971. The temporary suspension of 1914 became the permanent fiat currency system of today. What was sold as emergency became eternal standard. Federal Reserve emergency lending facilities created in 2008 were supposed to be temporary crisis response mechanisms. The term asset-backed securities loan facility, the commercial paper funding facility, and other programs were explicitly temporary. But when the facilities expired, the legal authority to recreate them remained. When the 2020 crisis hit, the Fed reactivated these programs within days. What had been emergency tools became standard instruments of monetary policy, available for use whenever the Fed determines conditions warrant intervention. The emergency toolkit became the normal toolkit. Bailouts can be disguised as patriotic duty or systemic necessity rather than what they actually are. Transfers from taxpayers to bank shareholders. The framing is everything. In 1914, bank rescues were presented as supporting the war effort. Banks needed support so they could finance mobilization. Opposing bank bailouts meant opposing the war effort and endangering national security. This made opposition to bailouts appear unpatriotic. Questioning the bailout was questioning victory itself. Dissent was treason. In 2008, bank rescues were presented as preventing systemic collapse and protecting depositors. The alternative to TARP was presented as a complete meltdown of the financial system, Great Depression-level unemployment, and chaos. This made opposition to bailouts appear reckless and ignorant. The framing obscured the reality that bank shareholders and bondholders could have been wiped out while depositors were protected and the banking system restructured under government control. But that alternative was never seriously considered. The conversation was framed to make bailout appear inevitable. In 2020, bank support was presented as pandemic relief and supporting the broader economy. The Fed's interventions were framed as helping businesses and workers survive lockdowns. This obscured the fact that most of the support went to financial assets and large corporations, not to small businesses or workers. The framing made the interventions politically popular, even though the primary beneficiaries were wealthy asset holders. The language of helping everyone disguised the reality of helping the few. But the language worked. It always does. Most importantly, those who created the crisis consistently end up more powerful after the rescue than they were before the collapse. This is the fundamental pattern. The institutions whose recklessness created crisis are rescued and emerge larger and more powerful. The individuals who made the bad decisions keep their positions and often receive bonuses. The system that failed is not reformed, but is instead reinforced. Crisis becomes opportunity for the connected and powerful. Failure is the path to dominance. The incompetent become indispensable. In 1914, the banks that had over-leveraged themselves and made bad loans were rescued and emerged dominant. The Rothschilds, Morgan, the major British, French, and German banks all survived and prospered. The individuals who had made the risky decisions kept their positions. Some bankers even became government ministers or central bank governors, moving seamlessly between private banking and public policy. The crisis that should have destroyed them instead made them indispensable. Their failure made them essential. Incompetence was rewarded with power. In 2008, the largest banks that had created the housing bubble and the derivatives crisis received the largest bailouts and emerged as dominant institutions. Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan Chase, Bank of America, Citigroup, and Wells Fargo not only survived, but expanded through acquisition of failed competitors. Their CEOs kept their jobs. Very few banking executives faced criminal prosecution, despite widespread fraud and mis-selling of securities. The crisis that should have broken up the too-big-to-fail banks made them bigger and more untouchable. Crime paid, fraud was rewarded. In 2020, the largest corporations and financial institutions received the most support. The Federal Reserve's interventions primarily supported financial asset prices, benefiting the wealthy who own most stocks and bonds. The Paycheck Protection Program, that was supposed to help small businesses, saw billions flow to large companies through loopholes and weak oversight. The billionaire class saw their wealth increase by over $1 trillion during 2020, while tens of millions of workers faced unemployment. Crisis transfers wealth upward, always and everywhere. The global banking system today faces the same structural vulnerabilities that threatened it in 1913, only exponentially larger in scale. Banks are again over-leveraged with derivatives exposure measured in the hundreds of trillions. The Bank for International Settlements estimates global over-the-counter derivatives notional amounts exceed $600 trillion. This represents exposure that is multiples of global GDP. If even a small fraction of these derivatives go bad, the losses would be larger than government's ability to bail out the system. The system is more fragile now than in 1913. Central banks have pushed traditional tools to their absolute limits with interest rates and balance sheet operations. Interest rates remained near zero for over a decade after 2008. When rates finally rose in 2022 to 2023, the financial system immediately showed stress. Banks faced unrealized losses on bond portfolios. Commercial real estate values collapsed. Regional banks failed. The system had become so dependent on ultra-low interest rates that any normalization caused crisis. We're addicted to cheap money. Withdrawal causes convulsions. Central bank balance sheets expanded to unprecedented sizes. The Federal Reserve's balance sheet peaked at $9 trillion, equivalent to 40% of US GDP. The European Central Bank, the Bank of Japan, and other major central banks saw similar expansions. These balance sheets are filled with assets purchased at inflated prices during crisis interventions. If marked to market, the losses would be enormous. Central banks are technically insolvent, but can't admit it without triggering crisis. The emperor has no clothes, but no one dares say so. The same interconnected fragility exists where one major failure could trigger systemic collapse. Banks hold deposits at other banks and have counterparty exposure through derivatives and other contracts. The 2008 crisis demonstrated how quickly contagion can spread. Lehman Brothers' failure nearly brought down AIG, which would have triggered failures at Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley, which would have spread to European banks. Only massive government intervention prevented complete meltdown. That was 2008. The system is even more interconnected now. The system is even more interconnected now than in 2008. The largest banks have grown larger. The complexity of financial instruments has increased. The notional amount of derivatives has continued growing. Settlement and clearing systems concentrate risk in a few critical nodes. The failure of a major bank or clearinghouse could cascade through the system in hours, leaving authorities no time to organize a rescue. The systemic risk is greater now than at any point since 1914. We're living on borrowed time. Warning signs are visible to those watching closely, just as they were over a century ago. Bank executives quietly sell personal stock positions, while regulators grant exemptions that don't make headlines. The insiders position themselves before the public understands what's coming. Jamie Dimon, CEO of JP Morgan Chase, sold over $140 million of personal stock in 2023 to 2024, his first significant sale in years. Other banking executives have made similar moves, taking profits at high prices while their public statements remain optimistic. Why do you think that is? These insider sales are reported to the SEC and are publicly available information, but they receive little media attention. The pattern is clear to those watching. Executives with the best information about their institution's true condition are reducing their personal exposure. They're not predicting specific timing, but are positioning defensively in case conditions deteriorate. This is similar to the private advice wealthy clients received in 1913 to convert deposits to gold. The smart money is quietly moving. Are you paying attention? Regulators have quietly granted exemptions to capital requirements and other rules without public announcement. After the 2023 regional bank failures, regulators delayed implementation of Basel III capital requirements that were supposed to make banks safer. The official reason was that banks needed more time to prepare. The real reason was that implementing the requirements would reveal that many banks don't have sufficient capital and would need to raise money or reduce dividends, potentially triggering a confidence crisis. Reality is being hidden to prevent panic. The Federal Reserve has expanded its balance sheet support programs again in 2023 to 2024 after attempting to reduce the balance sheet. The Bank Term Funding Program, created in March 2023, allows banks to borrow against underwater bonds at par value, hiding losses that should be recognized. This is creative accounting enabled by regulatory forbearance, similar to the accounting games of 1914 to 1918 that hid bank insolvency during the war. The same tricks are being used again. History doesn't repeat, but it certainly rhymes. History reveals a pattern that most people miss entirely. Banking crises aren't failures of the system. They're opportunities for consolidation and transformation. This is the key insight. From the perspective of the largest banks and their executives, crises are profitable. They eliminate competition. They justify interventions that increase bank power. They create opportunities to acquire assets cheaply. They expand the scope of government guarantees. Crisis is the business model. Instability is the product. The pattern is clear across multiple centuries. Every major banking crisis results in greater concentration of the industry. Smaller banks fail or are acquired. Larger banks receive government support and emerge dominant. The percentage of banking assets controlled by the largest institutions increases after each crisis. Competition decreases. Political influence of the largest banks increases. The system becomes more oligopolistic with each cycle. This isn't accidental. This is the design. The crashes are features, not bugs. The 2008 crisis provided a perfect example. The 5 largest American banks controlled approximately 35% of industry assets in 2007. By 2015, they controlled over 45%. The crisis that supposedly threatened the banking system actually strengthened the position of the largest banks. They acquired failed competitors at bargain prices with government support. They received bailout funds that smaller banks couldn't access. They gained market share while thousands of community banks disappeared. Crisis made them stronger, not weaker. Every major conflict or economic crisis coincides with fundamental changes to the financial architecture. World War I ended the classical gold standard and established central bank dominance over monetary policy. The Great Depression ended gold convertibility domestically and concentrated power in central banks. World War II led to the Bretton Woods system that formalized dollar hegemony. The 1971 Nixon shock ended international gold convertibility. The 2008 crisis expanded central bank powers beyond traditional boundaries. Each crisis is used to implement changes that would be impossible during normal times. Crisis is opportunity for transformation. The institutions that survived World War I were those positioned to benefit from the reset, not those caught unprepared. The Rothschilds survived because they had reduced risky exposure before the crisis hit. JP Morgan survived because it had positioned itself as the coordinator of Allied financing. The largest British, French, and German banks survived because they had the size and political connections to access government support. Smaller, regional, and less connected banks failed. Success wasn't about prudence, it was about positioning and connection. This pattern continues. The institutions that survived 2008 were not those with the best risk management or the most conservative practices. Lehman Brothers failed while Goldman Sachs survived. Not because Goldman was better managed, but because it had better political connections and received government support Lehman was denied. Bear Stearns was forced into acquisition by JP Morgan, while Citigroup received unlimited government backing, not because of different business models, but because of different political relationships. Connection determines survival, not competence. Current geopolitical tensions may serve the same function that 1914 tensions did, providing cover for a financial system restructuring that's already necessary. The banking system is again over-leveraged and facing structural problems. Central banks have exhausted traditional tools. Government debt levels are unsustainable. Commercial real estate is collapsing. Regional banks are sitting on huge unrealized losses. The system needs a reset, but implementing that reset during normal times would be politically difficult. Crisis provides cover for necessary restructuring. A major geopolitical crisis could provide the perfect cover. War with China over Taiwan, escalation in Ukraine, conflict in the Middle East. Any of these could serve the same function World War I served, justifying emergency measures that would otherwise be unacceptable. Gold confiscation or capital controls could be imposed as national security measures. Bank bailouts could be framed as supporting war effort. Inflation could be blamed on war disruption rather than monetary policy. The pattern is available for use whenever needed. The playbook sits ready. When they talk about financial stability, the question becomes stability for whom? The system is designed to preserve institutions, not the savings of ordinary people. This is the fundamental point that most people don't understand. When officials talk about maintaining financial stability, they mean preventing the failure of major financial institutions. They don't mean protecting the purchasing power of your savings or your ability to access credit on fair terms. Stability means the institutions survive. What happens to you within that stable system is considered secondary. Financial stability in official usage means that banks can continue operating, stock markets remain open, and the payment system functions. It doesn't mean that you can afford housing, or that your wages keep pace with inflation, or that your retirement savings maintain their value. Stability means the institutions survive. What happens to ordinary people within that stable system is considered secondary. You are not the system. The banks are the system. Your role is to support them. This explains why central banks prioritize preventing deflation, even though deflation would benefit most people by making goods cheaper. Deflation is dangerous for banks because it increases the real value of debts. Banks are net debtors. Their liabilities exceed their assets. Deflation strengthens the real value of their obligations, while reducing the value of their assets. This threatens bank solvency. Therefore, central banks fight deflation vigorously, while tolerating inflation that harms savers and wage earners. Policy serves banks, not people. Deposits represent bank liabilities, and every crisis transfers that burden back to depositors through inflation, bailouts, or currency devaluation. Your bank deposit is not really your money. Legally, it's a loan you made to the bank. The bank owes you the money, but the bank has lent most of that money to others. The bank doesn't have your money. It has promises from borrowers to repay loans. If those borrowers default, your deposit is at risk. You think you're a customer. Actually, you're a creditor. When crisis hits, banks are rescued through mechanisms that harm depositors. Inflation reduces the real value of your deposit. You get back the same number of currency units, but they buy less. Bailouts require taxes or money printing that come at your expense. Currency devaluation makes foreign goods more expensive, reducing your standard of living. The bank is saved, but your savings are depleted. This is the mechanism of wealth transfer that operates during every crisis. You lose so they can win. Understanding this pattern provides something most people lack: the ability to see what's actually happening rather than accepting official narratives. The official narrative is always about stability, prudence, preventing panic, protecting the system. The reality is always about protecting specific institutions and their shareholders at the expense of the broader public. If you can see past the rhetoric to the actual wealth transfers, you can position yourself better. Knowledge is power, but only if you act on it. This doesn't require insider information or complex financial knowledge. It requires understanding the pattern. When crisis hits, governments will rescue banks at public expense. This has happened in every major crisis for over a century. It will happen in the next crisis. Currency will be debased to transfer wealth from savers to debtors. This is the consistent pattern. Recognizing it allows you to position accordingly. The pattern is the prediction. History is the map. Real security doesn't come from trusting bank promises, but from recognizing when the cycle is repeating. Bank deposits are promises to pay. Government bonds are promises to pay. Paper currency is a promise of value. All of these promises depend on the banking and monetary system maintaining stability and credibility. When the system is under stress, these promises become less reliable. Real security comes from assets that don't depend on institutional promises. Real estate, precious metals, productive businesses, practical skills. Promises break. Assets endure. Those who understand crisis patterns position differently than those who trust institutional assurances. In 1913, wealthy insiders quietly moved assets out of banks and into gold before the crisis hit. They didn't trust official reassurances that everything was sound. They positioned defensively based on their understanding of systemic vulnerabilities. In 2007, some investors recognized housing bubble risks and positioned for collapse, while officials insisted subprime problems were contained. In 2023, some depositors withdrew funds from regional banks before failures occurred. The informed act. The trusting lose. The generation that lived through World War I learned these lessons too late. They trusted the system. They believed official assurances. They kept their savings in bank deposits and government bonds denominated in gold-backed currency. They assumed their purchasing power was secure. By 1920, they realized their mistake. Their savings had been inflated away. The gold backing was gone. The bonds paid in depreciated currency. A generation of savers was wiped out. Don't be that generation. Those who learned the lessons early positioned differently. They converted paper assets to real assets. They bought farmland, precious metals, productive businesses. They diversified across jurisdictions. They maintained some assets outside the banking system. These people preserved their wealth through the crisis, while their neighbors who trusted the system lost everything. The difference wasn't intelligence or luck. It was understanding the pattern and positioning accordingly. Will you understand in time, or will you learn through loss? This generation doesn't have to repeat that mistake. Banks faced extinction before World War I broke out. Today, they face the same structural problems with a system even more precarious than before. The leverage is higher. The interconnectedness is greater. The derivatives exposure is larger. The government debts are more massive. The central banks have less ammunition. Every metric of systemic risk is worse now than in 1913. The math doesn't work. The system can't continue. Something will break. The question isn't whether another reset is coming. It's what emergency will be used to justify it this time. War didn't disrupt the banking system in 1914. It saved banks from their own failures. The next crisis, whether it's presented as war, pandemic, cyber attack, climate emergency, or some other danger, will similarly be used to implement measures that rescue the banking system at public expense. The specific justification doesn't matter. The pattern is what matters. Watch for the crisis. It's coming. The next crisis will further consolidate banking power unless enough people recognize the pattern being repeated. If the public understood what happened in 1914 and how that pattern has repeated in every subsequent crisis, they might resist bailouts more effectively. They might demand that bank shareholders and bondholders bear losses instead of taxpayers. They might insist on breaking up too big to fail institutions. They might support fundamental reform of the monetary system. But this requires widespread understanding. of the pattern, and that understanding is exactly what the financial establishment works to prevent. Financial education doesn't teach you about the pattern. Economics courses don't explain how crises transfer wealth. History books don't connect 1914 to 2008 to 2020. The media doesn't highlight insider trading or regulatory capture. The pattern is hidden in plain sight, visible to anyone who looks but obscured by complexity and misdirection. They don't want you to understand. Understanding threatens their system. The signals are already being sent if you know where to look. Bank stock movements, regulatory policy shifts, and Federal Reserve decisions all tell a story beneath the official explanations. Understanding the system as it actually operates is the only real protection available. The next chapter in this pattern is being written right now. Will you be prepared when it arrives? Or will you trust the system and lose everything like the generation of 1914? So here we are at the end of our journey tonight, and I want to leave you with something important. The story we just explored together isn't ancient history. It's the blueprint for understanding what's happening right now. The same patterns, the same mechanisms, the same wealth transfers from the many to the few. World War I didn't disrupt the banking system. It saved banks from their own failures, and every crisis since has followed the same playbook. Do you see it now? Think about your own situation, your own savings, your own family's financial security. Are you positioned based on official assurances that everything is fine? Or are you positioned based on understanding the pattern? The insiders are already moving. Bank executives are selling stock. Wealthy families are diversifying into real assets. Central banks are preparing emergency facilities. The next act of this century-old play is about to begin. The question is, which side of it will you be on? Thank you so much for joining me on this incredible journey through financial history tonight. Thank you for your curiosity, your patience, and your willingness to think deeply about how money and power really work in our world. If this opened your eyes to patterns you hadn't seen before, share it with someone who needs to understand. Talk about it with your family. Question the official narratives. Prepare accordingly. The pattern is clear for those who choose to see it. Until next time, sleep well, and remember, those who understand history don't have to repeat its mistakes. The generation that lived through 1914 learned too late. This generation still has time, but time is running out. The signals are everywhere. The pattern is repeating, and the next crisis will separate those who understood from those who trusted. Rest easy, friend. And when you wake, look at the world with new eyes.